In the early months of the year 508 BC, Rome was beginning to believe that the worst might actually be over. The Republic had survived its first full year. The Tarquins were defeated, scattered into exile or dead. The Battle of Silva Arsia had proven that Roman citizens defending their freedom could defeat professional armies serving tyrants. The conspiracy of the young patricians had been exposed and crushed. The Temple of Jupiter stood completed on the Capitoline Hill, its terracotta decorations gleaming in the winter sun, a monument to Roman piety and achievement. The consuls for this new year, Publius Valerius Publicola, serving his second consecutive term, and Marcus Horatius Pulvillus also returning, were competent administrators who understood how to make the Republic function. The Senate met regularly and actually debated policies rather than rubber-stamping royal decrees. The assemblies voted, the courts operated, the markets bustled with commerce. It was almost boring, really, which was wonderful. After the chaos and violence of the previous year, boring was exactly what Rome needed. Time to consolidate, to establish precedents, to let the new system settle into comfortable routine. The citizens of Rome were adapting to their new identity. Children born in 509 BC would never know what it was like to live under a king. They would grow up as citizens of a republic, would think of freedom as normal rather than revolutionary. That transformation from extraordinary to ordinary, from radical innovation to simple fact of life, was perhaps the strongest evidence that the republic was working. But Rome's neighbours were watching all this with mixed feelings. Some of the Latin cities were genuinely impressed by what Rome had accomplished. They had their own grievances with tyrannical leaders, their own desires for more representative government. Rome's successful revolution suggested that change was possible, that monarchy wasn't inevitable. A few Latin cities even began experimenting with their own republican reforms, creating councils and assemblies that gave citizens more voice in governance. Others were more skeptical. Change was dangerous, they argued. Tradition existed for good reasons. These Romans, with their radical ideas about self-government, were going to destroy themselves and probably destabilize the entire region in the process. Better to maintain the old ways, however imperfect, than to risk chaos with untested innovations. And then there were those who saw Rome's revolution as an opportunity. The Etruscan cities to the north had always had a complicated relationship with Rome. They were the source of much Roman culture, architecture, religious practices. Even the toga itself was originally Etruscan. Many Romans had Etruscan ancestry, including the Tarquin family. Trade between Rome and the Etruscan cities had enriched both sides for generations, but Etruria was not a unified nation. It was a loose confederation of independent cities, each with its own king, each pursuing its own interests, sometimes cooperating but just as often competing. And one of the most powerful of these cities was Clusium, ruled by a king named Lars Porsenna. Lars Porsenna was by all accounts an impressive figure. He was wealthy, commanding significant resources from Clusium's agricultural lands and trade routes. He was militarily skilled, having expanded his city's influence through a combination of warfare and diplomacy. And he was ambitious, always looking for opportunities to increase his power and prestige. The fall of the Roman monarchy presented Porsenna with an interesting situation. On one hand, he had no particular love for the Tarquins. They had been rivals as much as allies. On the other hand, Rome's revolution had created instability, had weakened a city that had been growing increasingly powerful under Tarquin Superbus. A weakened Rome meant opportunities for cities like Clusium. The official story that Romans would tell later was that Porsenna acted out of monarchical solidarity, that he sought to restore the Tarquins because their overthrow threatened all kings everywhere. This made for a good narrative. The freedom-loving republic versus the tyrannical king who wanted to crush their liberty. The reality was probably more complicated and more pragmatic. Porsenna likely saw an opportunity to expand his influence, to perhaps bring Rome under Clusium's control, or at least extract favourable concessions. Whether he genuinely intended to restore Tarquin's family, or simply use them as a pretext, didn't really matter. What mattered was that he had a large, well-trained army, and he was planning to use it. The first hints of trouble came in late winter, when traders returning from the north brought unsettling news. Porsenna is mobilizing. A merchant named Gaius Volumnius reported to the Senate, standing nervously before the assembled senators. I saw it myself when I was in Clusium last month. Soldiers gathering, supplies being collected, weapons being forged. He's preparing for a campaign. Against whom? Asked Publicola. Though he suspected he already knew the answer. The talk in Clusium is that he intends to march on Rome, Volumnius said. They say he's received messages from the Tarquins asking for help. They say he's agreed to restore them to power, A murmur ran through the Senate. They had known the Tarquins wouldn't simply accept exile, that they would continue trying to return, but they had hoped, perhaps naively, that after the disaster at Silva Arsia, no one would be willing to support them. Apparently they had hoped wrong. How large a force? Marcus Horatius asked. As consul and as a military commander, he needed practical information. Hard to say exactly, Volumnius admitted. But Clusium is a wealthy city. Porsenna can field several thousand soldiers at least, and he may have allies among other Etruscan cities. Some of them see Rome's revolution as a threat to their own stability. The Senate erupted into debate. Some senators advocated immediate military preparation, mobilizing the legions while they still had time. Others argued for diplomacy, sending envoys to Porsenna to negotiate and avoid war if possible. Still others questioned whether the threat was even real. Perhaps this was just rumor and speculation, merchants getting nervous over nothing, publicola. Let them debate for a while, understanding that they needed to voice their concerns and opinions. But eventually he raised his hand for silence. "We will prepare for war," he announced, while attempting to avoid it through diplomacy. "We'll mobilize the legions, but we'll also send envoys to Clusium to speak with Porsenna directly. If he can be persuaded that attacking Rome serves no one's interests, we avoid bloodshed. If he cannot be persuaded, at least we're ready to defend ourselves." It was a reasonable compromise, the kind of balanced approach that characterized Publicola's leadership. Not recklessly aggressive, but not naively pacifistic either. Prepared for the worst while hoping for better. The envoys were selected carefully. Respected senators known for their diplomatic skills. Men who could speak eloquently about Rome's desire for peace without appearing weak or frightened. They were given gifts to present to Porsenna, tokens of respect and goodwill. And they were given a clear message. Rome had no quarrel with Clusium, sought no conflict with the Etruscan cities, and hoped that Porsenna would respect Rome's right to govern itself as it saw fit. The envoys departed within days, riding north toward Clusium with a small escort. Rome waited anxiously for their return, hoping for good news, preparing for bad. Meanwhile, the mobilization began. It was more organized this time than it had been before the Battle of Silva Arsia. The Republic had learnt from that experience, had established clearer procedures for calling up the legions, had better systems for equipping and provisioning soldiers. The Campus Martius filled with citizens reporting for military service, but this time the chaos was more controlled, the confusion less pronounced. Marcus Horatius took charge of the military preparations, his experience from Silva Arsia proving invaluable. He organized the soldiers into centuries and cohorts, assigned commanders, arranged for supplies and equipment. He also began planning defensive strategies. If Porsenna did attack, how would Rome defend itself? "We can't meet him in open battle the way we did with the Tarquinian forces," Horatius explained to Publicola and the senior military commanders. "Porsenna likely has a larger, better-equipped army. Fighting him on open ground favors his superior numbers." "So we defend the city?" Publicola asked. "We defend the city, and make it as costly as possible for him to attack us," Horatius confirmed. "Rome's walls are strong. We have the Tiber as a natural barrier on one side. If we can hold the bridges and make sure the city is well supplied, we can withstand a siege longer than he can maintain one. Sieges are expensive. Eventually, Porsenna will have to either commit to a costly assault or withdraw." It was sound military logic. Rome's advantages were defensive, strong walls, a loyal population, and the ability to wait out an attacker. Porsenna's advantages were offensive, a larger army, better equipment, and the initiative of choosing when and where to strike. A siege played to Rome's strengths while minimizing Porsenna's, but sieges were also terrible for the people inside the besieged city. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread in crowded conditions. The constant anxiety of wondering if today would be the day the walls were breached took a psychological toll. Defending Rome meant asking its citizens to endure significant hardship. "Will the people support this?" Publicola asked. "Will they accept a siege rather than surrender? They overthrew a king rather than live as subjects," Horatius pointed out. "I think they'll endure a siege rather than surrender to another one, but we should make sure they understand what's at stake, what might be asked of them." So Publicola called an assembly in the Forum, addressing the gathered citizens with the same directness that had characterized his consulship. "Romans," he said, standing on the rostra where Brutus had stood just months earlier, "we face a threat from the north. Lars Porsenna of Clusium is gathering an army. He may be coming to restore the Tarquins. He may simply see our revolution as an opportunity to expand his own power. His exact motivations don't matter as much as the fact that he represents a danger to the republic we've built. The crowd was silent, attentive. After the previous year's crises, they had learned to take threats seriously. We've sent envoys to negotiate, Publicola continued. Perhaps war can be avoided through diplomacy. Perhaps Porsenna will respect our right to govern ourselves and choose peace over conflict. But we must prepare for the possibility that he will choose war. And if he does, if his army marches on Rome, we will have to defend our city and our freedom. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. Citizens from all walks of life, patricians and plebeians, merchants and farmers, young and old. A siege is not easy, Publicola said honestly. It means shortages, means hardship, means danger. But it also means showing the world that Rome will not surrender its freedom, that we will endure whatever is necessary to remain free men and women. We overthrew a tyrant. We established a republic, and we will defend it against anyone who threatens it. The response was not quite the immediate roar of approval that had met Brutus's revolutionary speeches. This was more sober, more measured. People understood what was being asked of them, understood the reality of what a siege might mean. But there was also determination in their faces, a quiet resolve that said they would do what was necessary. An elderly veteran of the Silver Arcia battle stood and addressed Publicola directly. Consul, I fought to free Rome from the Tarquins. I lost friends in that battle. I'll be damned if I let some Etruscan king undo what we won. If Porsenna wants Rome, he can try to take it. But it won't be easy, and it won't be cheap. Others voiced similar sentiments. Not bloodthirsty enthusiasm for war, but sober determination to defend what they had built. It was, in its way, more impressive than passionate speeches. These were people who understood the cost and were willing to pay it anyway. The envoys returned from Clusium, 3 weeks after they had departed. Their news was not encouraging. Porsenna received us courteously, the lead envoy reported to the Senate. He listened to our message, accepted our gifts, treated us with respect. But he made his position clear. He views Rome's revolution as illegitimate and destabilizing. He believes the Tarquins have a right to their throne, and that Rome owes them restoration. Did you explain that the Roman people chose to expel the Tarquins? Publicola asked. That the Republic exists by popular consent? We did. He was unimpressed by that argument. He said that the people are like children who sometimes need to be reminded of their proper place. He said that kings rule by divine right, and that popular assemblies are an aberration that leads only to chaos. It was a fundamental disagreement about governance, about legitimacy, about the nature of authority itself. Porsenna genuinely believed in monarchy as the natural God-ordained form of government. The idea that people could choose their own leaders struck him as not just wrong but dangerous, a violation of cosmic order. He's coming, then, Horatius said. It wasn't really a question. He's coming, the envoy confirmed. He gave us a message to bring back to you. He said that if Rome restores the Tarquins voluntarily and submits to his arbitration, he will be merciful and generous. But if Rome resists, he will take the city by force and make an example that will discourage other cities from following Rome's rebellious path. Generous of him, Publicola said dryly, giving us the option to surrender our freedom voluntarily before he takes it by force. What did you tell him? Asked one of the senators. We told him that Rome's government is determined by Romans, not by Etruscan kings. That we respect Clusium's right to govern itself as it sees fit, and expect the same respect in return. That we hope for peace, but will defend ourselves if necessary. How did he respond to that? He smiled and said he looked forward to seeing if Roman courage matched Roman rhetoric. So there it was. Diplomacy had failed. War was coming. The only questions now were when Porsenna would arrive and whether Rome would be ready when he did. The preparations intensified. Grain was stockpiled in warehouses throughout the city, enough to feed Rome's population for months if necessary. Water sources were secured and protected. The walls were inspected and repaired where needed. The bridges over the Tiber, Rome's most vulnerable points, were reinforced and garrisoned with soldiers. Families made their own preparations. Those with property outside the city walls brought in what they could before Porsenna's army cut off access. Those with relatives in the countryside arranged for them to take shelter in the city or flee to safer locations. Everyone hoped for the best while preparing for the worst. And then, on a cold morning in early spring, the scouts came racing back to Rome with the news everyone had been dreading. He's coming, the lead scout reported. His horse lathered with sweat from the hard ride. Porsenna's army is 2 days' march from Rome. maybe 15,000 men, well-equipped and well-organized. They'll be here by tomorrow evening. The Senate convened immediately. The military commanders gathered. The final preparations were made. There was no more time for debate or deliberation. The Etruscan army was coming, and Rome would have to face it. Publicola stood before the Senate one last time before the siege began. "The Republic is about to face its greatest test," he said. "Not from internal conspiracy or from exiled tyrants, but from a powerful king who believes Rome's freedom is a threat to the natural order. He's wrong, and we're going to prove it. We're going to show him and the world that free people defending their freedom are stronger than any army serving a king's ambition. Rome endures," Marcus Horatius said, standing beside his fellow consul. "The Republic endures. Whatever comes, we face it together as citizens, not as subjects." The Senate echoed the sentiment. Rome endures. That night, the last night before the siege began, Romans looked out from their 7 hills at the approaching darkness and wondered what the coming days would bring. Fear, certainly. Hardship, almost definitely. But also the chance to prove that their revolution had been worth it, that freedom was worth fighting for, that the Republic could defend itself against any threat. In the Forum, where Lucretia's body had lain, where Brutus had sworn his oath, where the Republic had been born in blood and determination, a few late-night travellers paused to look up at the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. The temple gleamed in the moonlight, a testament to what Rome had built. Tomorrow, Lars Porsenna's army would arrive. Tomorrow, the siege would begin. Tomorrow, Rome would discover whether its freedom was as real as it claimed, or just a temporary aberration in the eternal march of monarchy. But tonight, Rome was still free, and its citizens intended to keep it that way. The shadow from the north was approaching, and Rome stood ready to meet it. Lars Porsenna's army arrived at Rome's gates on a grey afternoon, when the spring sky was heavy with clouds that threatened rain, but never quite delivered, which was somehow appropriate. There was a sense of something ominous hanging over everything, waiting to break but not yet breaking. The Etruscan force was impressive in a way that made even experienced Roman soldiers feel a cold knot of anxiety in their stomachs. 15,000 men, possibly more, arrayed across the fields north of the city in formations that spoke of discipline and training. Their armor gleamed, not the mismatched collection of equipment that Rome's citizen militia wore, but standardized bronze breastplates and helmets that marked them as a professional fighting force. Their shields bore the symbols of Clusium and allied Etruscan cities. Their spears stood in perfect rows, a forest of bronze-tipped wood stretching as far as the eye could see. And at the center of it all, mounted on a white horse and surrounded by his personal guard, was Lars Porsenna himself. From the walls of Rome, the consuls and military commanders watched the Etruscan army deploy. They had known intellectually that Porsenna commanded a formidable force. Seeing it arrayed before them made that knowledge visceral, immediate, impossible to dismiss as mere rumor or exaggeration. That, Marcus Horatius observed, is a lot of soldiers. Astute military analysis, Publicola replied, though his attempt at levity didn't quite hide his own concern. Remind me why we thought defending the city was a good idea. Because meeting them in open battle would be suicide, and surrendering would mean the end of the Republic, Horatius said. Those were our options. This was the least terrible one. Remind me of that when we're eating rats, because the food ran out. I will. And I'll remind you that eating rats as free men is preferable to eating well as subjects of a king. It was the kind of dark humor that soldiers used to cope with fear. And both consuls were experienced enough in warfare to recognize it for what it was. They were scared. They would have been fools not to be, but they were also determined, and sometimes determination mattered more than confidence. Porsenna did not immediately attack. He was too experienced a commander for that. Instead, he set up camp in a methodical, professional manner that would have impressed any military observer. Tents were pitched in organized rows, latrines were dug at proper distances from the camp, supply lines were established, sentries were posted. Within hours, what had been empty fields was transformed into a temporary city housing 15,000 men, complete with its own internal order and organization. The message was clear. Porsenna was not here for a quick raid or a single dramatic assault. He was here for the long term, prepared to wait as long as necessary for Rome to either surrender or be starved into submission. The first action Porsenna took was to cut off Rome's supply lines. Etruscan soldiers moved to control all the roads leading into the city, establishing checkpoints and patrols that prevented anything from entering or leaving. Farmers who had been bringing produce to Rome's markets found themselves turned back. Merchants with goods to trade were stopped at spear point. The flow of food, materials and information that had sustained the city's daily life was abruptly severed. Rome, for all its advantages of walls and defensive position, had one critical vulnerability: it could not feed itself indefinitely. The city's population of perhaps 50,000 people, the number is debated by historians, but it was substantial, required enormous amounts of food daily. Much of that food came from the surrounding countryside, from farms and orchards and fishing villages that were now cut off by Etruscan forces. The city did have stockpiles, thanks to Publicola's foresight in preparing for exactly this situation. Warehouses throughout Rome held grain, preserved meat, dried fish, olive oil, wine, enough to sustain the population for several months if rationed carefully. But months, not indefinitely. The clock was ticking from the moment Porsenna's forces cut off access to the outside world. The psychological impact of the siege was immediate and profound. One day Romans had been going about their normal lives, trading in the forum, attending the courts, arguing in assemblies, living as free citizens in a free city. The next day they were trapped, unable to leave, unable to bring in supplies, watching from their walls as an enemy army settled in for a long stay. It's hard to overstate how unsettling this was for people who had never experienced a siege before. Wars in the Roman experience were things that happened elsewhere, in the forests of Silver Arsia, in the territories of conquered enemies, on distant battlefields. The idea of war coming to Rome itself, of being trapped inside their own city while enemies camped outside, was alien and frightening. Children asked their parents when the bad men would leave. Parents had no good answers. Merchants watched their inventory, knowing that what they had was all they would have for the foreseeable future. Families with relatives outside the city worried about them, wondered if they were safe, had no way to send messages or receive news. The Senate met daily to coordinate the city's defense and manage resources. These were long, contentious sessions as senators debated how to ration food, how to maintain order, how to keep morale from collapsing entirely. "We need to reduce the grain dole," one senator proposed. "The public grain distribution is consuming our stockpiles too quickly. We need to cut the rations by a third, maybe half." "Cut the rations and you'll have riots," another objected. "The plebeians are already anxious. Starve them, and they'll turn on us before Porsenna ever breaches the walls. Better to stretch our supplies and maintain order than to eat well for 2 months and then have nothing," the first senator insisted. "Better to trust the people to endure hardship if we're honest with them." Publicola interjected. "We'll reduce the dole, yes, but we'll explain why, and we'll make sure the reduction applies equally to everyone. Patricians eat the same rations as plebeians. No exceptions, no special privileges. We're all Romans enduring this together." It was the kind of egalitarian approach that had earned Publicola his nickname, Friend of the People. In a crisis, when resources were scarce and tensions high, fairness mattered as much as military strategy. If the plebeians believed the patricians were hoarding food while they starved, the Republic would tear itself apart from within, accomplishing Porsenna's goal without him having to lift a sword. The new ration system was announced in the Forum. Daily grain distributions would continue, but at reduced levels. All citizens would receive the same amount, regardless of status or wealth. Anyone caught hoarding food or selling it at inflated prices would face severe penalties. Romans grumbled, of course. People always grumble when their circumstances deteriorate. But the grumbling was manageable, not mutinous. Most citizens understood that some hardship was necessary, that this was the price of defending their freedom. As long as they believed the burden was being shared fairly, they would endure it. Life inside besieged Rome took on a strange quality, a mixture of normality and surrealism. The markets still operated, though with dwindling inventory and inflated prices. The courts still heard cases, though attendance was sparse and the proceedings perfunctory. Children still played in the streets, though their games now included Romans versus Etruscans with stick swords and improvised shields. But underneath this veneer of normal life was constant anxiety. Every day began with the same question: would this be the day Porsenna attacked? Every night ended with the same relief that the attack hadn't come yet, mixed with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the question again. The walls became a gathering place for Romans who wanted to see what was happening, to observe the enemy camp, to reassure themselves that the Etruscans were still just sitting there and not actively storming the city. Guards had to shoo away civilians who crowded the ramparts, getting in the way of soldiers who are actually supposed to be watching for threats. "It's like they think this is entertainment," one frustrated centurion complained to Marcus Horatius. "They bring their families up here to look at the Etruscan camp as though it's some kind of spectacle. Let them look." Horatius replied, "It reminds them what we're facing, why we're enduring these hardships. As long as they're not interfering with actual military operations, let them see the enemy. It's better than hiding in their homes imagining things that are worse than reality." Porsenna, for his part, seemed content to wait. His strategy was clear. He didn't need to assault Rome's strong walls if he could simply starve the city into submission. Every day the siege continued. Rome's supplies diminished. Eventually the mathematics would become undeniable. The city would run out of food, and then the defenders would have to choose between surrender and starvation. It was a sound strategy, one that had worked for besieging armies throughout history. The defenders' will to resist was strong at first. But as supplies dwindled and conditions deteriorated, that will eroded. People who would initially rather die than surrender changed their minds when death from starvation became an immediate rather than abstract prospect. But Porsenna also engaged in psychological warfare, attempting to break Roman morale before hunger did the job for him. Etruscan soldiers would march close to the walls, just out of arrow range, and shout taunts and insults. They would describe the meals they were eating: fresh bread, roasted meat, wine, while Romans inside the city ate diminishing rations of grain porridge. They would call out offers of amnesty to any Roman who wanted to abandon the city and join Porsenna, promising food and safety in exchange for defection. "Your republic is a fantasy," one Etruscan soldier shouted up at the walls. "You're starving for an idea that will die with you. Porsenna offers food, peace, and order. Open your gates and live." The Roman soldiers on the wall generally responded with crude insults and obscene gestures, which was about what you'd expect from men under stress. But the taunts had an effect nonetheless. Doubt was insidious. It crept in during quiet moments, whispered questions that were hard to answer convincingly. Was this worth it? Was the Republic really better than monarchy, if it meant starving behind walls? What if Porsenna was right? What if this experiment in self-government was just going to get everyone killed? The consuls and senators worked hard to counter this creeping demoralization. They held regular assemblies where they reminded citizens why they were fighting, what they had achieved by overthrowing the Tarquins, what they stood to lose if they surrendered now. Porsenna promises food and peace, Publicola told one such assembly. And perhaps he's telling the truth. Perhaps if we surrender, he will be merciful, will feed us, will restore order. But it will be his order, not ours. It will be peace on his terms, not freedom on our terms. We will be subjects again, not citizens. Everything we've built, everything Lucretia and Brutus died for, will be undone. Is that really preferable to some hungry months defending what we've won? The speeches helped, but only so much. Words couldn't fill empty stomachs, or ease the anxiety of watching an enemy army camp outside your walls. Rome's morale was holding, but it was fragile, dependent on the belief that the siege would eventually end, that Porsenna would either give up or be forced to withdraw. The problem was that there was no clear reason why Porsenna would give up. He had the superior position. Time was on his side. As long as his own supply lines held, and they seemed to be functioning well, he could sit outside Rome indefinitely while the city slowly consumed its stockpiles. What Rome needed was a way to change the equation, to shift the advantage, to demonstrate that the siege was not the one-sided affair it appeared to be. They needed to show Porsenna that Roman determination went beyond passive endurance, that there were Romans willing to take active, even reckless action in defense of their freedom. They needed heroes. Unfortunately, though they didn't know it yet, they were about to get them, but that would come later. For now, in these early days of the siege, Rome simply endured. Citizens ate their reduced rations and tried not to think about how much longer the food would last. Soldiers stood watch on the walls, staring out at the Etruscan camp, wondering if today would be the day the attack came. Senators debated strategies and calculated supplies and tried to project confidence they didn't entirely feel. The Tiber River became increasingly important to besieged Rome. While Porsenna controlled the land approaches to the city, he couldn't easily control the river itself. Small boats could still move up and down, bringing in some supplies, maintaining some contact with the outside world. It wasn't enough to sustain the city indefinitely, but it helped, and it provided a psychological boost. Rome wasn't completely cut off, wasn't entirely alone. Porsenna recognized this vulnerability in his siege, and began working to close it. Etruscan forces moved to control the river crossings, to establish their own boat patrols, to make it as difficult as possible for anything to reach Rome via the Tiber. The contest over the river became a siege within the siege, an ongoing struggle for control of Rome's last remaining connection to the outside world. The bridges over the Tiber were the critical points. Rome had several bridges connecting the city proper to the far bank of the river, and these bridges were now the front lines of the siege. If Porsenna's forces could capture the bridges, they could cross the river and attack Rome from a direction where the walls were weaker. If Rome could hold the bridges, they could maintain at least some access to supplies and reinforcements. The most important of these bridges was the Pons Sublicius, the oldest bridge in Rome, a wooden structure that had stood for generations. It was the main crossing point, the broadest and most accessible bridge, and therefore the one Porsenna most wanted to capture. Marcus Horatius reinforced the guard on the Pons Sublicius, placing his best soldiers there, making sure it was defended at all times. He also made plans for what to do if the bridge couldn't be held, how to destroy it if necessary, how to prevent Porsenna from using it, how to buy time for the city to prepare other defences. If they take the Pons Sublicius, Horatius explained to his officers, they can pour forces across the river directly into the city. We can't let that happen. We hold that bridge or we destroy it. Those are the only acceptable options. The officers nodded, understanding the stakes. The Pons Sublicius was more than just a bridge. It was a symbol, a statement that Rome controlled its own territory, that Porsenna's siege had limits. Losing it would be a psychological blow as much as a military one. On the 10th day of the siege, Porsenna made his first serious move. Etruscan forces advanced on the Pons Sublicius in force, testing the Roman defences, probing for weaknesses. The Roman guards on the bridge fought them back, but it was a hard fight, and everyone understood that this was just a probe, a test. The real assault would come later, when Porsenna was ready, and it would be far more serious. After the skirmish, Horatius walked along the bridge, inspecting the damage, checking on his soldiers, thinking about what would happen when Porsenna attacked in earnest. The bridge was defensible, but only barely. A determined enemy force could overwhelm the defenders if they were willing to accept casualties, and Porsenna had enough men that he could afford to accept significant casualties if it meant taking the bridge. Rome needed a miracle, or at least they needed someone willing to do something miraculous, something so audacious and brave that it would change the entire character of the siege, that would show both Rome and Porsenna that the Republican spirit was stronger than cold military calculation suggested. They would get that miracle. Multiple miracles, actually, over the coming weeks. But first, they would have to survive the darkest moment of the siege, when it seemed like everything might collapse, when the Pons Sublicius stood on the edge of falling, when Rome's freedom hung by the slenderest of threads. That moment was approaching fast, and when it came, it would require a kind of courage that defied rational calculation, a willingness to sacrifice everything for an abstract principle, a belief that some things mattered more than survival. Rome was about to discover what its citizens were truly made of, and the answer would become legend. The serious assault on the Pons Sublicius came 3 days after the first probe, on a morning when fog rolled in from the Tiber and reduced visibility to a few dozen feet. It was excellent weather for an attack. The defenders on the bridge couldn't see the enemy force gathering until it was almost upon them, couldn't organize a proper response in time, which was of course exactly why Porsenna had chosen this moment. The first warning the Romans had was the sound of hundreds of men moving through the fog, the tramp of feet and the clink of armor, creating a noise that was somehow more terrifying for being invisible. The guards on the bridge raised the alarm, but by then the Etruscan forces were already advancing, a mass of soldiers emerging from the mist like something out of a nightmare. The Roman defenders on the far side of the bridge, perhaps 50 men holding the bridgehead position, found themselves suddenly facing hundreds of Etruscans. They fought bravely, desperately, holding their shields locked together and trying to prevent the enemy from reaching the bridge itself. But they were outnumbered 10 to 1, and courage alone couldn't compensate for that kind of disparity. Within minutes, the bridgehead position was overrun. The surviving Roman soldiers fell back onto the bridge itself, fighting as they retreated, trying to buy time, trying to hold the Etruscans back for just a little longer. Behind them, on the Rome side of the bridge, reinforcements were arriving, but not fast enough, not in sufficient numbers to actually stop what was happening. Marcus Horatius, not the consul but a junior officer who commanded the bridge garrison, watched the disaster unfold with a sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't a probe or a test anymore. This was the real assault, the one they had been dreading, and it was going far too well for the Etruscans. If the enemy reached the Rome side of the bridge, if they established a foothold on this bank of the Tiber, they could pour forces across and attack the city from an unexpected direction. The walls on this side weren't as strong, hadn't been reinforced as thoroughly. Rome could fall not to starvation but to a surprise attack through a bridge that was supposed to be defended. "Pull everyone back to the city side," Horatius shouted to his men. "We can't hold the bridge. Fall back and prepare to destroy it." It was the right military decision. They had always known that if the bridge couldn't be held, it would have to be destroyed to prevent the enemy from using it. Better to lose the bridge than to lose the city. but destroying a bridge takes time. The pons Sublicius was a substantial wooden structure, built to carry heavy traffic, designed to last for generations. You couldn't just knock it down with a few axe strikes. You had to cut through support timbers, weaken key structural points, and do it all while the enemy was trying to stop you. The Roman soldiers retreated to the city side of the bridge, and immediately began the demolition work. Men with axes started hacking at the support beams. Others worked to loosen the planking, to disconnect sections of the structure. It was hard, urgent work, made more difficult by the knowledge that enemy soldiers were advancing across the bridge even as they tried to destroy it. "How long?" Horatius asked the engineer supervising the demolition. 10 minutes if we're lucky." The engineer gasped, his axe rising and falling against a thick support timber. 15 if we're not, maybe longer if they interfere with the work. 10 to 15 minutes. An eternity when enemy soldiers were crossing the bridge, when every second brought them closer to Rome's walls. HORATIUS COCLES. The historical sources give him this cognomen, meaning one-eyed, suggesting he had lost an eye in some previous battle. Looked back at the bridge, at the Etruscan forces advancing across it, at the narrow choke point where the bridge met the shore, and he made a decision that would echo through Roman history for centuries. "I'll hold them," he said. The engineer stared at him. "What?" "I'll hold the bridge while you destroy it," Horatius repeated. "Get me 2 men who can fight and who aren't needed for the demolition. We'll hold the bridgehead on this side, buy you the time you need." "That's suicide," the engineer said bluntly. 3 men against their entire army? You'll die in minutes. "Maybe," Horatius agreed. "But minutes is all you need, isn't it? 10 to 15 minutes and the bridge is down. I can give you 10 minutes. It was insane. It was absolutely, completely insane. No rational military calculation suggested that 3 men could hold a bridge against hundreds, could survive 10 minutes of sustained assault, could do anything except die quickly and pointlessly. But Horatius wasn't thinking in terms of rational military calculation. He was thinking about what Rome needed, what message this would send, what it would mean for the Republic if they destroyed the bridge without anyone even trying to defend it. And he was thinking about his own honor, about what kind of man he wanted to be, about how he wanted to be remembered if these were going to be his last minutes alive. "I need 2 volunteers," Horatius called out to the soldiers working on the demolition. 2 men to hold the bridge with me while it's destroyed. You'll probably die. I'm not going to lie about that. But you'll die defending Rome, and that has to count for something. For a moment, no one moved. Then a young soldier named Spurius Latius stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "I'll stand with you." "Thank you," Horatius said simply. Another soldier, Titus Herminius, joined them. 3 is a better number than 2, he said. "More symmetric. If we're going to do something stupid, we might as well do it properly." Horatius smiled grimly. "Good. Then let's go be heroes or fools." "Probably both." The 3 of them advanced back onto the bridge, moving against the flow of retreating Romans, pushing their way through soldiers who were fleeing toward safety while they marched toward certain danger. They positioned themselves at the narrow point where the bridge met the shore, where the geography created a natural choke point that 3 men might actually defend, at least briefly. The Etruscan forces were perhaps 50 feet away, advancing cautiously now, uncertain why these 3 Romans were standing there when everyone else had retreated. Then they saw the demolition work beginning behind the 3 defenders, saw the axes falling on support timbers, understood what was happening. "They're destroying the bridge." Someone in the Etruscan ranks shouted, "Forward, get across before they bring it down." The Etruscans charged, and the battle began. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the nature of fighting in a narrow space with only 3 defenders. The Etruscans had hundreds of men, but they couldn't all attack at once. The bridge was only wide enough for perhaps 4 or 5 men to stand abreast, so despite their overwhelming numbers, they could only bring a handful of soldiers to bear against Horatius and his companions at any given moment. This was Horatius's advantage, the calculation that made his stand theoretically possible, rather than completely impossible. 3 skilled soldiers, fighting defensively, could hold off 5 or 6 attackers for at least a short time, not indefinitely. Exhaustion would eventually take its toll, or they would make a mistake, or the enemy would get lucky, but for minutes at least, and minutes was all the demolition team needed. Horatius stood in the center, his shield locked with those of his companions on either side, creating a wall of bronze and wood across the bridge. His gladius was ready, his stance balanced, his eyes focused on the approaching enemy, with the kind of calm that came from accepting that you were probably going to die. The first Etruscan soldiers reached them and attacked with spears, thrusting at the wall of shields, trying to break through or find an opening. Horatius and his companions absorbed the blows on their shields, pushed back, struck with their swords when opportunities appeared. A man fell, then another. The Etruscans pulled back slightly, regrouped, attacked again. Behind them, 20 feet away, the demolition continued. Axes bit into wood. Support timbers groaned under the strain. The engineer called out updates. 5 more minutes. Keep them back for 5 more minutes. 5 minutes. Horatius had been fighting for perhaps 2 minutes already, though it felt like hours. His shield arm was already aching from the repeated impacts. Sweat ran down his face despite the morning chill. His breathing was coming hard and fast, adrenaline and exertion combining to make everything feel simultaneously too fast and too slow. Spurious Latius on his left took a spear thrust to the shoulder, the weapon slipping past his shield guard and biting into flesh. He cursed but didn't fall, shifted his stance to compensate, kept fighting. Titus Herminius on the right was bleeding from a cut above his eye, blood running down his face and obscuring his vision, but he blinked it away and held his position. The Etruscans, frustrated by their inability to break through 3 men, began trying different tactics. Some attempted to push forward bodily, using their mass to overwhelm the defenders. Others threw spears from a few feet back, trying to hit the Romans without getting close enough to be struck in return. Still others called out offers. Surrender now and you'll be spared. Keep fighting and you'll die for nothing. Horatius responded by ramming his shield into an attacker's face, breaking the man's nose and sending him stumbling backward. For Rome, he shouted. And it wasn't just a battle cry, but a reminder to himself and his companions of why they were doing this insane thing. For the Republic. 3 minutes, the engineer called out. The bridge is almost ready to collapse. Just 3 more minutes. 3 minutes might as well have been 3 years. Horatius's arms felt like lead. His shield was getting heavier with every passing second, the accumulated weight of exhaustion making it harder to raise, harder to hold position. Beside him, Latius was swaying, his wounded shoulder barely supporting his shield. Herminius was breathing in ragged gasps, his earlier wound having taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. They couldn't hold for 3 more minutes. They were at the edge of their endurance. One mistake or one lucky enemy strike away from collapsing. Fall back. Horatius shouted to his companions. Get across now, I'll hold them alone. Like hell you will. Latius gasped. But even as he spoke, his knees buckled, his wounded shoulder finally giving out. He collapsed onto the bridge planking, his shield clattering beside him. Go, Horatius insisted, pushing Herminius toward the safety of the shore. Get Latius out of here. I'll finish this. Herminius hesitated for perhaps a second, torn between loyalty and survival. Then he grabbed Latius and half-dragged, half-carried him off the bridge, leaving Horatius alone. One man. Standing alone on a bridge, facing hundreds of enemies, buying time for his city's defenders to destroy the very bridge he stood on. It was the kind of moment that legends are made of, the kind of act that defies practical explanation and exists purely in the realm of symbolism and sacrifice. The Etruscans paused, staring at this single Roman who had somehow held them back for 7 or 8 minutes already, who was now standing alone, who clearly intended to keep fighting until he died or the bridge collapsed beneath him. One man, someone in the Etruscan ranks shouted, "Just kill him and let's get across." They attacked again, but something had changed in the dynamics of the fight. Now it wasn't just a military action, a tactical necessity, it was personal. This lone Roman was standing there, defying them, insulting them with his very existence. The Etruscans attacked with anger now, with frustration, with the wounded pride of soldiers who couldn't believe they were being held back by a single man, which, ironically, made them less effective. They were fighting emotionally now rather than tactically, crowding forward in ways that actually prevented them from bringing their numbers to bear, getting in each other's way in their eagerness to be the one to kill this impossible Roman. Horatius fought like a man possessed. His sword rose and fell, blocked and thrust, parried and struck. His shield, battered and splintered from dozens of blows, still held. Men fell before him, or fell into the Tiber when pushed off the sides of the narrow bridge. Others pressed forward to take their places, and Horatius met them all. 1 minute, the engineer's voice, distant but clear. The bridge is ready. Get off the bridge. 1 minute. Horatius just had to hold for 1 more minute. 60 more seconds, and then the bridge would collapse and Rome would be saved. Except he had a problem. He was standing on the bridge. When it collapsed, he was going to collapse with it. And the Tiber, while not impossibly wide, was cold and deep and rushing with spring runoff. Falling into it while wearing armor, and exhausted from combat was likely to be fatal. But that had always been part of the calculation, hadn't it? This had never been about survival. This had been about buying time, about making a statement, about showing that there were Romans willing to die for their freedom. If Horatius died here, so be it. At least he would die as a hero, as a free man defending his city, as someone who mattered. 30 seconds. The engineer's voice, urgent now. Horatius, get off the bridge, now. Horatius struck down one more Etruscan soldier, then turned and ran. Not out of fear, but out of calculation. He had held them as long as was needed. Now it was time to see if he could survive his own heroism. He sprinted toward the shore, his exhausted legs pumping, his battered armor clanking with each step. Behind him, the Etruscans realized what was happening and gave chase, also sprinting, hoping to catch him before the bridge collapsed. The bridge groaned. Support timbers that had been cut nearly through finally gave way under the stress of hundreds of men running across the structure. The planking began to sag, then to tilt, then to collapse entirely. Horatius was perhaps 10 feet from solid ground when the bridge gave way beneath him. He felt the wood dropping away, felt gravity taking over, and then he was falling, plunging toward the Tiber along with sections of demolished bridge and several Etruscan soldiers who had been too close behind him. He hit the water with tremendous force, the cold taking his breath away, the current immediately pulling at him, trying to drag him down or sweep him away. His armor, so useful in combat, was now a terrible liability, its weight pulling him under the surface. Horatius struggled, kicking toward what he hoped was up, fighting against the water and the weight and the exhaustion that made every movement feel impossible. His lungs burned, his vision darkened. For a moment he thought this was it, that he would drown mere seconds after completing his heroic stand, would die not from enemy action but from the river itself. Then hands grabbed him. Roman soldiers who had been watching from the shore had plunged into the Tiber when they saw him fall, were now pulling him up, dragging him toward the bank. He broke the surface, gasping, coughing up river water, being hauled onto solid ground by men who were laughing and crying and shouting all at once. He made it, someone was shouting. By all the gods, he actually made it. Horatius lay on the bank of the Tiber, coughing and shivering and utterly exhausted, and looked back at where the bridge had been. The Pons Sublicius, Rome's oldest bridge, was gone, collapsed into the river, its timbers floating away on the current, its connection between the shores severed. And on the far bank, the Etruscan army stood staring, unable to reach Rome, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. One man, or 3 men really, but one man at the end, had held them back long enough to destroy the bridge they needed to capture. It was militarily significant, certainly. Rome had maintained control of this critical crossing point, had prevented Porsenna from using it to attack the city. But more than that, it was symbolically powerful in a way that military analysis couldn't fully capture. Rome had a hero, a genuine, unambiguous hero, who had done something impossible, who had stood alone against an army, who had bought his city the time it needed through sheer audacity and courage. It was exactly the kind of story the besieged city needed, the kind of inspiration that could sustain morale through weeks or months of hardship. News of Horatius's stand spread through Rome within hours. By evening, everyone in the city knew what had happened at the bridge. Parents told the story to their children, soldiers told it to each other, senators discussed it in the Curia. And with each retelling, Rome's confidence grew a little stronger, their determination to resist a little firmer. If one man could hold back Porsenna's entire army, if Roman courage could achieve something so impossible, then maybe the siege could be survived after all. Maybe the Republic could endure. On the far side of the Tiber, watching his army stare at the ruins of the bridge, Lars Porsenna was also reflecting on what had just happened. He had seen many brave men in his military career, had fought numerous battles, had witnessed countless acts of courage, but what he had just seen went beyond ordinary bravery. That bordered on insanity, on a level of commitment to a cause that defied rational calculation. These Romans, he was beginning to realize, were not going to break easily. They believed in their republic with a fervor that made them dangerous, made them willing to do things that no sensible person would attempt. You couldn't starve people like that into submission, couldn't intimidate them, couldn't wait them out. You could only respect them, and perhaps reconsider whether conquering them was worth the cost. Horatius Cocles, the man who held the bridge, would become legendary. Poets would write about him. Historians would chronicle his deed. Parents would tell their children about the hero who stood alone. And for centuries afterward, Romans would invoke his name when they needed to remind themselves what Roman virtue looked like, what courage meant, what it meant to put duty before survival. But all of that was later. Right now, on this foggy morning by the Tiber, Horatius was just a very tired, very wet soldier who had somehow survived something he probably shouldn't have. And Rome was a city that had just gained a reason to hope. The siege continued, but its character had changed. And sometimes that's all a hero can give you. Not victory, but the belief that victory might be possible. Horatius's stand at the bridge brought Rome something precious, time and morale. But it didn't fundamentally change the strategic situation. The pons Sublicius was destroyed, yes, which prevented Porsenna from using it to attack the city, but Rome was still besieged, still cut off from supplies, still watching its food stockpiles slowly diminish with each passing day. The heroic defense had won a battle, but the war continued. And wars, unfortunately, are not won by individual acts of courage alone. They're won by logistics, by resources, by the cold mathematics of who can endure longer, and those mathematics still favoured Porsenna. In the days following the bridge's destruction, Lars Porsenna adjusted his strategy. If he couldn't take Rome by direct assault, he would tighten the siege further, make it even more difficult for anything to reach the city. Etruscan patrols on the Tiber increased. The land approaches were watched more carefully. The noose around Rome drew tighter. Inside the city, the mood was complex. Horatius's heroism had inspired people, had given them a story to hold on to, a reason to believe that Roman courage could overcome impossible odds. Children played at being Horatius, defending imaginary bridges with stick swords. Adults told and retold the story, each version growing slightly more embellished, the Etruscan army growing larger, the defense lasting longer, the heroism becoming more heroic. But inspiration didn't fill stomachs. The grain rations continued to diminish. The warehouses that had seemed so well stocked at the siege's beginning were now looking alarmingly depleted. The calculations were unavoidable. At current consumption rates, Rome had perhaps 6 weeks of food remaining, maybe 8 if they reduced rations even further. But there were limits to how little people could eat and still function. 6 to 8 weeks. That was how long Rome had to either break the siege or negotiate terms. After that, starvation would force a surrender that courage alone couldn't prevent. The Senate met to discuss options. The debates were long, contentious, and increasingly desperate. Every suggestion was picked apart. Every plan revealed to have fatal flaws or unacceptable risks. We could try to break through the siege lines, one senator proposed. Gather our forces, punch through in one direction, open a supply line, and lose half our army in the attempt. Another interrupted. Porsenna has us outnumbered. A breakout attempt would be suicide. We could send envoys again. Try to negotiate. We tried negotiating before the siege began. Porsenna made his terms clear. Restore the Tarquins or be conquered. Those terms haven't changed. What if we offered him something else? Territory, tribute, trade concessions. He doesn't need our territory or tribute. He wants to make an example of us. To show other cities what happens when you overthrow your king and try this republican nonsense. We can't negotiate our way out of this. The frustration in the Curia was palpable. These were intelligent, experienced men who understood statecraft and military strategy, and they were confronting the reality that sometimes intelligence and experience weren't enough, that sometimes you faced problems with no good solutions. It was during one of these dispiriting debates that a young patrician named Gaius Mucius stood to speak. He was not a senator, too young, not yet having held the necessary offices, but he had been permitted to attend the session as an observer, as young men of prominent families often were, learning the business of governance by watching their elders. Consuls, senators, Mucius said, his voice carrying across the Curia despite his youth. I have a proposal, not a solution perhaps, but a possibility. Publicola looked at him with interest. He knew the Mucii family, good people, old stock, solid republicans. Speak, Gaius Mucius. The Senate welcomes your thoughts. Horatius showed us that individual action can change strategic situations, Mucius began. One man held back an army. One man's courage shifted the siege's momentum. I propose that one man might end the siege entirely. How? Asked Marcus Horatius Pulvillus, the consul. One man cannot lift a siege that involves 15,000 soldiers. No, Mucius agreed. But one man can kill the king who leads those soldiers. The Curia went silent. Everyone understood what Mucius was suggesting, but the audacity of it took a moment to fully register. You're proposing assassination, someone said finally. I'm proposing that someone infiltrate Porsenna's camp and kill him, Mucius clarified. Without Porsenna, the Etruscan alliance falls apart. The various cities are only cooperating because of his leadership. Remove him, and they'll likely withdraw, argue among themselves about succession, abandon the siege. Rome survives, and we only have to kill one man instead of fighting 15,000. It's insane, a senator objected. How would anyone even reach Porsenna? He's surrounded by guards, protected by his entire army. You'd never get close to him. Horatius's plan was insane too, Mucius pointed out. One man holding a bridge against hundreds shouldn't have worked. But it did, because Horatius was willing to try it. I'm willing to try this. Publicola studied the young man carefully. You're volunteering for this suicide mission yourself? Yes, Consul. I'm young, I'm expendable, and I speak Etruscan fluently. My mother was from Tarquinii. I can pass as one of Porsenna's soldiers or servants. I can get close to him, and I can kill him, and then you'll die, Publicola said bluntly. His guards will cut you down before you can escape. Probably, Mucius admitted. But if my death saves Rome, that's an acceptable trade. Horatius was willing to die on the bridge. I'm willing to die in Porsenna's camp. It's the same principle, one life for the city. The Senate debated this proposal for over an hour. The arguments against it were numerous and reasonable. It was too risky. The chances of success were minimal. It violated the customs of warfare. It was dishonorable to kill an enemy commander outside of battle. It would make Rome look desperate and frightened. The arguments in favor were simpler but more compelling. It might work, and they were running out of other options. Eventually Publicola called for a vote. The Senate, by a narrow majority, approved Mucius's mission, not because they thought it would succeed, necessarily, but because doing something, anything, was preferable to simply sitting and waiting for starvation to force surrender. If you manage to kill Porsenna, Publicola told Mucius after the vote, you'll be a hero greater than Horatius. If you fail, you'll likely die, and Rome might face retaliation. Do you understand the risks? I understand, Consul, Mucius replied, and I accept them. Then may the gods guide your hand and protect you. Rome is counting on you. The preparation for Mucius's mission took several days. He needed to observe Porsenna's camp, learn its layout, understand the routines of the guards and servants, identify opportunities for infiltration. He spent hours watching from the walls, noting patterns, memorizing details. He also needed to prepare himself mentally for what he was about to do. Killing in battle was one thing. It happened in the heat of combat, in self-defense, with adrenaline and fear and necessity, all combining to make the act almost automatic. But what Mucius was planning was different. Cold-blooded assassination, deliberately getting close to a man and killing him, required a different kind of resolve. Mucius spent time with his family, saying goodbyes that were carefully phrased to avoid sounding final, but which everyone understood might be final nonetheless. His father, a stern old patrician who had fought in numerous wars, clasped his son's hand and said simply, "Do honor to our family name. Die well if you must die." His mother, the Etruscan woman who had given him the language skills that made this mission possible, was less stoic. "Come back," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Kill the king if you can. But come back. Rome has enough martyrs." "I'll try," Mucius promised, though they both knew how unlikely it was. On the appointed night, a dark night with a new moon, when visibility would be poor and guards less alert, Mucius left Rome through a small postern gate on the riverside of the walls. He carried no weapons openly, nothing that would mark him as a soldier, just a simple knife hidden in his clothing, the kind of tool any servant might carry, unremarkable unless you knew to look for it. He made his way carefully toward the Etruscan camp, moving in the darkness, avoiding the main patrol routes he had observed over previous days. It took hours, slow hours of careful progress, but eventually he reached the outskirts of the enemy camp. The camp was less alert than he had hoped, but more alert than he had feared. Guards stood at regular intervals, but they weren't particularly vigilant. After weeks of siege with no serious action, they had fallen into complacency. Mucius watched them for a while, learning their patterns, then simply walked into the camp during a guard change when attention was at its lowest. The audacity of it was remarkable, really. He didn't sneak or hide. He just walked in like he belonged there, like he was a servant or soldier returning to camp, and in the darkness and confusion, no one questioned it. Sometimes the best disguise is confidence. Once inside the camp, Mucius faced his next challenge, finding Porsenna. The camp was huge, a temporary city of thousands of men, and the king could be anywhere, but Mucius had observed from the walls which tent was the command center. which area seemed to be the headquarters. He made his way there, still walking with purpose, still acting like he had every right to be wherever he was. Near the command tent, he saw a group gathered around a table, visible in the lamplight spilling from the tent's interior. One figure was clearly in charge, sitting at the head of the table, speaking with authority while others listened and took notes. The figure was richly dressed, wearing the kind of ornate clothing that marked high status. That had to be Porsenna. Who else would be conducting business at this hour? Receiving reports, giving orders. Mucius checked the position of the guards. They were watching outward, protecting against external threats, not particularly concerned about someone already inside the camp. He moved closer, his hand finding the knife hidden in his clothing. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. One strike, one accurate thrust, and Porsenna would die, and the siege would end, and Rome would be saved. One man's life for a city's freedom. It was a trade Mucius was willing to make. He moved quickly, covering the last few feet in a rush, his knife coming out, driving forward toward the richly dressed figure's back. The blade went in smoothly, finding flesh, and Mucius felt a moment of savage triumph. Then several things happened very quickly. The richly dressed man collapsed, blood spreading across his fine clothes. The other men at the table shouted in alarm. Guards came running from all directions, and one of the men, a tall authoritative figure who had been standing slightly apart from the group, spoke in a voice of command and anger. "Seize him. Don't kill him. I want him alive." Mucius realized with horror that the voice belonged to Lars Porsenna, the actual Lars Porsenna, who was standing right there, very much not dead. He had killed the wrong man. In the darkness and confusion, he had mistaken Porsenna's secretary, or paymaster, or some other important official who dressed richly and sat at the command table for the king himself. The one chance he would ever have, the culmination of days of planning and risk, and he had killed the wrong person. The guards grabbed Mucius roughly, disarming him, forcing him to his knees. He didn't resist. There was no point. He had failed, and now he would pay for that failure with his life. At least it would be quick, probably. A sword to the neck, a moment of pain, then nothing. But Porsenna didn't order his immediate execution. Instead, the king approached, studying this young Roman who had just killed one of his most trusted advisors. "Who are you?" Porsenna demanded in Etruscan. "Why have you done this?" Mucius could have stayed silent, could have denied responsibility, could have played for time or mercy. Instead, he responded in the same language, clearly and defiantly. "I am Gaius Mucius, a Roman citizen. I came here to kill you, to end this siege, to save my city. I failed, which I regret, but I'm not sorry I tried. Rome is worth dying for." Porsenna was silent for a moment, processing this. Then he spoke again, his voice dangerous. "You will tell me everything. How you infiltrated my camp, whether others are coming, what Rome's plans are. You will tell me, or you will die slowly and painfully. Choose." This was the moment. Mucius understood that he was going to die regardless of what he said. Porsenna might promise mercy for information, but kings rarely kept such promises to assassins. So Mucius had nothing to lose by maintaining his defiance, by showing this Etruscan king exactly what Roman resolve looked like. "I have nothing to tell you," Mucius said, "and your threats mean nothing to a free Roman who has already accepted death." "Everyone fears pain," Porsenna said. "Everyone breaks eventually. You will tell me what I want to know." "No," Mucius said. "I won't, and I'll prove it to you." Before anyone could stop him, before the guards realized what he was doing, Mucius thrust his right hand into the brazier of hot coals that sat near the command tent, providing light and warmth. His hand, his sword hand, the hand that had failed to kill Porsenna, plunged into the glowing coals. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, worse than anything he had ever experienced. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Mucius clenched his teeth, refusing to scream, refusing to pull his hand away, holding it in the fire until the guards finally grabbed him and yanked him back. His right hand was ruined, burned, blistered, the flesh charred and destroyed. He would never use it properly again, would be left-handed for the rest of his life. But he looked at Porsenna with eyes that showed no fear, no regret, only defiant pride. "That," Mucius said through gritted teeth, "is how little a free Roman fears death or pain. I will tell you nothing, because nothing you can do to me is worse than failing Rome. Kill me if you want, torture me if it pleases you, but you will get nothing from me except the knowledge that there are 300 Romans just like me who have sworn to kill you. I was the first. I failed. But others will come, and one of them will succeed. You can kill me, but you cannot stop them all. Your life is forfeit, Porsenna. You just don't know when. It was a bluff, of course. There weren't 300 assassins waiting. Mucius had acted alone, with the Senate's reluctant approval, but no coordinated conspiracy backing him up. But Porsenna didn't know that, and the image of 300 determined Romans, each willing to die to kill him, each as fearless of pain and death as this young man who had just burned his own hand, that was terrifying in a way that armies weren't. Porsenna stared at Mucius for a long moment, at this young Roman who had infiltrated his camp, killed his advisor, and then mutilated himself rather than show fear. It was the kind of fanaticism that no military force could defeat, the kind of commitment to a cause that made victory Pyrrhic at best. "Release him," Porsenna said finally. The guards looked confused. "My king." "Release him," Porsenna repeated. "Give him safe passage back to Rome, and send a message to the consuls. Tell them that Lars Porsenna requests negotiations. It's time to discuss terms for ending this siege." The guards obeyed, still uncertain but not willing to question their king's orders. Mucius was given medical treatment for his burned hand, basic, painful but enough to prevent immediate infection, and then escorted back toward Roman lines under a flag of truce. He walked through the enemy camp in a daze of pain and exhaustion and confusion. He had failed to kill Porsenna, but had somehow achieved something anyway, had somehow impressed the Etruscan king enough that the siege might actually end. His right hand throbbed with agony, would never work properly again, would mark him as disfigured for life, but he had done what he set out to do, in a way. Not by killing Porsenna, but by showing him what he was up against, what kind of people Romans were, what lengths they would go to defend their freedom. Sometimes that was enough. When Mucius reached Roman lines and was brought before the consuls, Publicola looked at him with a mixture of horror and pride. "Your hand is gone," Mucius said simply. "I'm left-handed now. You can call me Scaevola if you want." Scaevola, the Latin word for left-handed. It would become his cognomen, the name history would remember him by. "Did you kill Porsenna?" Horatius Pulvillus asked. "No. I killed his secretary or paymaster or someone. Wrong target. But I apparently convinced him that Rome has 300 more assassins waiting to try where I failed. So he wants to negotiate. So it worked out, sort of. Not the way I planned, but I'll take it." Publicola clasped the young man's shoulder carefully, mindful of his injuries. "You're a hero, Gaius Mucius Scaevola. You and Horatius both. Rome will remember what you did." "Rome had better remember," Scaevola said, "because I'm never going to forget it. Every time I try to do something with my right hand and remember I can't, I'll be reminded of this night for the rest of my life." It was dark humor, the kind of joke that people made when they were dealing with trauma. But it was also true. Scaevola would carry the mark of this night forever, would be known by it, defined by it, remembered by it, but he had saved Rome. Not by killing a king, but by showing the king what he was dealing with, what kind of people he was trying to conquer. And sometimes, that was the greater victory. News of Mucius Scaevola's mission spread through Rome almost as quickly as the story of Horatius at the bridge had. Within hours everyone knew that a young Roman had infiltrated Porsenna's camp, had attempted to assassinate the king, had killed the wrong man, and had then burned his own hand rather than show fear or give up information. The reaction was complex. On one level, Romans celebrated another hero, another act of audacious courage that demonstrated Roman virtue and determination. Children added Scaevola to their games alongside Horatius, and young men spoke admiringly of the kind of courage it took to destroy your own hand rather than break under interrogation. On another level, though, there was something unsettling about the story. Horatius had been defending a bridge, protecting Rome in a way that was clearly military and honourable. Scaevola had been attempting assassination, infiltrating an enemy camp under false pretenses, trying to kill a man outside of open combat. It was effective, perhaps, but was it honourable? Was it the kind of thing Romans should celebrate? The Senate debated this question in one of their sessions because the Senate in these early days of the Republic debated everything, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. "Assassination is not the Roman way," one elderly senator argued. "We fight our enemies openly, in battle, with honour. Sneaking into camps and murdering people in the night is what barbarians do, not civilized Romans. We're besieged and starving," another senator countered. "This isn't a normal war where we can afford to be precious about honour." Scaevola did what needed to be done, or at least tried to. That takes a different kind of courage than fighting in formation, but it's courage nonetheless. "But what precedent does this set?" the first senator insisted. If we celebrate assassination, if we tell our young men that murdering your enemies through deception is virtuous, what kind of society are we creating? What separates us from tyrants who murder their opponents? Context separates us, Publicola interjected, cutting through the debate with characteristic directness. Scaevola wasn't murdering a political rival or an innocent person. He was trying to kill the king of an army that's besieging our city and threatening our existence. That's war, not murder. It's unconventional, yes, but war doesn't always follow conventional patterns, and it worked. Marcus Horatius Pulvillus added. Or at least it achieved something. Porsenna wants to negotiate. That's more than we had before Scaevola's mission. This was the crucial point that eventually settled the debate. Whatever the moral complications of Scaevola's actions, they had produced results. Porsenna had sent envoys to Rome, requesting formal negotiations, the first serious diplomatic contact since the siege began. That was worth celebrating, even if the method of achieving it made some senators uncomfortable. The Etruscan envoys arrived 2 days after Scaevola's return, under a flag of truce, escorted through Roman lines with all the ceremony appropriate to diplomatic representatives. They were received in the Curia, before the assembled Senate, with Publicola and Horatius Pulvillus presiding. The lead envoy was a dignified Etruscan nobleman, named Orens Tarquinius, ironically sharing the family name of Rome's expelled kings, though apparently not closely related. He spoke Latin fluently, which simplified the proceedings, and delivered Porsenna's message with formal courtesy. Lars Porsenna, King of Clusium, Lord of the Etruscan League, sends greetings to the Senate and people of Rome. Runs began. My king has observed your city's courage and determination. The defense of your bridge by Horatius Coocles was remarkable. The attempt by Gaius Mucius to end this war through personal sacrifice, however misguided, demonstrated a level of commitment that my king respects. We're gratified that your king recognizes Roman courage, Publicola replied dryly. Though we would have preferred he recognize it before besieging our city. Azarans smiled slightly. My king's original intention was to restore the Tarquins to their rightful position. He believed that Rome's revolution was illegitimate, that the natural order required royal authority, that republican government would lead only to chaos and instability. And now? Horatius Pulvillus asked. Does he still believe this? My king has reconsidered. Aaron said carefully. Your republic has demonstrated that it can function under extreme pressure, that it can inspire loyalty and courage in its citizens, that it has achieved a stability that many kingdoms cannot match. King Porsenna has concluded that Rome's government is Rome's business, not his. A murmur ran through the Senate. This was significant. Porsenna was essentially acknowledging that he had no right to interfere in Rome's internal affairs, that the republic's legitimacy was not his to judge. So the siege will end? One senator asked hopefully. That depends on the terms we can agree upon, Arunz replied. King Porsenna is willing to withdraw his forces and end the blockade, but he requires certain concessions in exchange, certain assurances that the peace we establish will be lasting and mutually beneficial. What concessions? Publicola asked, his voice carefully neutral. Arunz pulled out a scroll and read from it. First, Rome will agree to a formal treaty with Clusium, recognizing our respective territories and establishing trade relations on favorable terms. Second, Rome will provide hostages as surety for the treaty's observance, noble youths from prominent families, to be held in Clusium for a period of 1 year. Third, Rome will return certain territories that were captured from Veii during the previous conflicts, as Veii is our ally, and we negotiated on their behalf. The Senate erupted in debate. Some of these terms were acceptable. A treaty was fine, trade relations were potentially beneficial. But hostages? Returning conquered territory? These were harder to swallow. Hostages are standard practice in treaty agreements, one senator pointed out. It's how both sides ensure the other keeps their word. It's not an insult, it's a practicality. It's standard when you've lost a war, another countered. We haven't lost. Why should we provide hostages when we successfully defended our city? Because we're running out of food, a third senator said bluntly. In 6 weeks, maybe less, we'll be forced to surrender anyway. If we can end the siege now on relatively favourable terms, that's a victory, not a defeat. The debate continued for hours, with Arunz waiting patiently while the Senate argued among itself. This was one of the inefficiencies of republican government that monarchs could avoid minus. Decisions took time, required consensus, involved messy public debate rather than simple royal decree. But it was also one of the strengths. By the time a decision was made, it had been thoroughly examined, its implications considered, its support base established. Eventually, the Senate reached a compromise position. They would accept Porsenna's terms with modifications. Yes to the treaty and trade relations, yes to hostages, but only for 6 months rather than a year, and the hostages would be well treated and returned unharmed. No to returning territories conquered from V. Those had been won in legitimate warfare, and Rome would not surrender them now. Publicola presented this counteroffer to Aruns, who listened carefully and then departed to convey it to Porsenna. The negotiations would continue, he said. This was just the beginning of what would likely be an extended diplomatic process, which was fine, as far as the Roman Senate was concerned. Every day spent negotiating was a day the siege continued, but it was also a day when military action was suspended, when tensions were lower, when hope for a peaceful resolution grew stronger. Negotiations were preferable to starvation. Over the following week, envoys travelled back and forth between Rome and Porsenna's camp. Terms were proposed, modified, rejected, revised, and proposed again. It was tedious work, the kind of careful diplomatic manoeuvring that never made for exciting stories but which determined the actual outcomes of conflicts more often than battles did. The sticking point, unsurprisingly, was the territory issue. Porsenna insisted that some lands taken from Veii needed to be returned as a gesture of good faith and to satisfy his ally. Rome insisted that conquered territory was Rome's by right and would not be surrendered. Both sides were dug in, and neither wanted to be seen as backing down. It was Publicola who eventually found the compromise. Rather than returning the disputed territories outright, Rome would agree to joint administration for a period of 5 years, after which the question of final ownership would be revisited. Neither side got everything they wanted, but both sides could claim they hadn't completely capitulated. It's not a perfect solution, Publicola told the Senate when presenting this compromise, but perfection is the enemy of good enough. This agreement gets the siege lifted, gets Porsenna's army away from our walls, and gives us time to recover our strength. In 5 years we'll be in a better position to negotiate final terms. Right now we need to accept what we can get. The Senate agreed. Though not unanimously, there were senators who felt Rome was giving up too much, who wanted to hold out for better terms, who believed that Porsenna would eventually withdraw without any concessions if Rome just remained stubborn enough. But the majority recognized the pragmatism of Publicola's approach and voted to accept the modified terms. The final treaty was elaborate and formal, written in both Latin and Etruscan, witnessed by representatives of both sides and by the gods invoked to oversee such agreements. It established peace between Rome and Clusium, set out trade terms, defined territorial boundaries, and specified the hostage arrangements. The hostages were the last detail to be settled. Rome would provide 10 young people from noble families, both male and female, as was traditional for such arrangements, to be held in Clusium for 6 months. They would be treated as honoured guests rather than prisoners, would be housed comfortably, would be free to move about the city under supervision. Their purpose was symbolic more than practical. They represented Rome's commitment to the treaty, their presence ensuring that Rome would not suddenly violate the agreement and attack Clusium. Selecting the hostages was a sensitive political matter. It needed to be prominent families, otherwise the hostages wouldn't carry sufficient weight as surety. But which families? How did you choose who would send their children to an Etruscan city for 6 months? Publicola made it simple. He volunteered one of his own nephews. Marcus Horatius Pulvillus did the same, offering his daughter. By having the consul's own families represented among the hostages, they ensured that no one could accuse them of asking sacrifices from others that they wouldn't make themselves. Other patrician families followed suit, some more reluctantly than others. Within days, 10 young Romans had been selected, 6 males ranging from 14 to 18 years old, and 4 females of similar ages. They were all from good families, all educated and well-mannered, all theoretically honoured to serve Rome in this capacity. The reality, of course, was more complicated. Being a hostage was not particularly dangerous. Porsenna had every incentive to treat them well, since mistreating them would violate the treaty and justify Roman retaliation. But it was still frightening, still meant being separated from family and home, still involved trusting your safety to a foreign king who had recently been trying to conquer your city. Among the female hostages was a young woman named Clogidia, daughter of a prominent patrician family, about 16 years old. The historical sources don't tell us much about her background, whether she had siblings, what her education had been like, whether she was excited or terrified by her selection as hostage. We know only that she was chosen, and that she accepted the role with whatever mixture of duty and fear any 16-year-old would feel in such circumstances. The exchange of hostages was conducted with full ceremony on the banks of the Tiber, at a location halfway between Rome's walls and Porsenna's camp. The 10 young Romans were formally handed over to Etruscan custody, their families watching from Rome's walls, no doubt fighting tears and trying to project confidence they didn't necessarily feel. Porsenna himself was present for the exchange, which was a mark of respect and an indication of how seriously he took this treaty. He received each hostage personally, spoke to them briefly in Latin, assured them they would be well treated, and returned safely when the 6 months ended. When Chloe was presented, Porsenna regarded her thoughtfully. "You are very young to bear such responsibility," he said, not unkindly. "I am a Roman," Chloe replied, her voice steady despite whatever nervousness she surely felt. "Romans bear whatever responsibilities their city requires." Porsenna smiled slightly. "So I have learnt. You will be comfortable in Clusium, young Clualia. You have my word as king." The hostages were led away toward Porsenna's camp, where they would remain for a few days before travelling north to Clusium itself. Their families watched them go, some crying openly now that the formal ceremony was over, others maintaining stoic dignity, all wondering if they had made the right decision in accepting this peace. With the hostages exchanged, the final terms of the treaty went into effect. Porsenna's army began breaking camp, the orderly process of demobilization that marked the official end of the siege. Tents came down, supplies were packed, soldiers formed into marching columns for the journey back to their various cities. Rome's gates opened for the first time in weeks. Citizens streamed out into the surrounding countryside, desperate to see their farms and properties, eager to begin the process of recovery. Merchants rushed to establish contact with suppliers. Farmers assessed damage to their fields and orchards. The city had survived. The Republic had endured. The siege was over. But not everyone was celebrating. The families of the hostages were anxious, worried about their children in Etruscan custody. Some senators were unhappy with the territorial compromises, feeling that Rome had given up too much. And there were those who simply felt exhausted, drained by weeks of stress and fear, too tired to feel relief even now that the danger had passed. Publicola understood this. In an assembly held in the Forum 3 days after Porsenna's departure, he addressed the mixed feelings that many Romans were experiencing. "We have survived," he told the gathered citizens. "The siege is lifted. Porsenna's army is gone. The Republic stands. But I know that not everyone feels like celebrating. Some of you lost loved ones in the fighting at the bridge. Some of you have children in Clusium as hostages. Some of you are looking at the terms of the treaty and wondering if we gave up too much." He paused, looking out over the crowd. "Here's what I want you to understand," Publicola continued. 6 weeks ago we were facing starvation and defeat. Today we have peace and the chance to rebuild. That's not a perfect outcome, but it's a victory nonetheless. We didn't surrender. We didn't restore the Tarquins. We didn't abandon the Republic. We stood firm, endured hardship, produced heroes who showed the world what Romans are capable of. And now we have the chance to prove that peace can be as well managed as war. What about the hostages? Someone called out from the crowd. What guarantee do we have that Porsenna will keep his word? None, Publicola admitted honestly. We have his word as king, and we have the treaty witnessed by the gods. But ultimately we're trusting him because we have to, because the alternative was unacceptable. If he betrays that trust, then we go to war again, and we do so with the moral high ground. But I believe he will keep his word. He impressed by Roman courage and honor. I think he'll respond with Etruscan courage and honor in return. It was the best assurance he could offer, and most Romans accepted it. They had to, really. The decision had been made, the treaty signed, the hostages exchanged. All that remained was to live with those choices and hope they had been the right ones. In Clusium, the Roman hostages were indeed being treated well. They were housed in comfortable quarters, fed adequately if not lavishly, allowed to interact with each other and with their Etruscan hosts. It was not freedom exactly, but it was far from imprisonment, more like supervised guest status, which was what hostage arrangements were supposed to be, but for young people accustomed to Roman freedom, to the ability to move about their city as they pleased, to the security of home and family. Even comfortable captivity was difficult. They were homesick, anxious, uncertain how to navigate Etruscan society and customs, and one of them, at least, was already beginning to think about whether hostage was a status she was willing to accept, or whether there might be another option available if she was brave enough to take it. But that story was still to come. For now, Rome was at peace. The Republic had survived its greatest test yet, and citizens could finally take a breath and begin the work of recovery. The siege of 508 BC was over, but its legends were still being written. Life as a hostage in Clusium was, objectively speaking, not terrible. Clusium and her fellow Roman hostages were housed in a comfortable villa on the outskirts of the city, with pleasant rooms and adequate food. They were allowed to walk in the villa's gardens, to speak with each other, to read and study. Their Etruscan guards were generally courteous, treating them more as guests than prisoners, but it was still captivity, however pleasant. They couldn't leave the villa grounds without permission and escort. They couldn't send messages home without those messages being read by their captors. They had no control over their circumstances, no agency in their own lives. Everything was decided for them, when they ate, where they went, what they could do. For young people accustomed to Roman freedom, this was harder than it might have been for subjects used to royal authority. The Republic had taught them that free people made their own choices, controlled their own destinies within the bounds of law and civic responsibility. Being hostages meant surrendering all that autonomy, however temporarily, and accepting that their lives were not their own for the next 6 months. Some of the hostages adapted better than others. A few of the young men, particularly the older ones, treated it almost like an extended diplomatic mission, an opportunity to learn about Etruscan culture and practice their language skills. They made friends with their guards, asked questions about Clusium's history and customs, tried to make the best of an uncomfortable situation. Others were more withdrawn, more homesick, counting the days until the 6 months ended and they could return home. They went through the motions of daily life, but invested nothing emotionally in their surroundings, maintaining psychological distance from Clusium and everything Etruscan. Cloida fell somewhere in between. She was polite to her guards, participated in the activities organized for the hostages, maintained her dignity and composure, but she was also quietly, intensely angry, not at Porsenna specifically, or at the Etruscans generally, but at the situation itself, at being treated as a bargaining chip, at having her freedom removed for political convenience. "It's only 6 months," one of the other female hostages said to her one evening, trying to be reassuring. "And then we go home, and we'll have done our duty to Rome, and we can tell our children about the time we were hostages in Clusium." 6 months is a long time, Clola replied. "A lot can happen in 6 months." "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet," Clolia admitted. "But I don't like being here. I don't like waiting passively for someone else to decide when I can have my freedom back. It feels wrong." The other girl looked worried. "You're not thinking of doing anything foolish, are you? We're supposed to be here. It's part of the treaty. If we cause problems, it could restart the war." "I know," Clenia said. "I'm not planning anything. I'm just saying I don't like it." But she was planning something, even if she hadn't fully admitted it to herself yet. Every day she observed the villa's routines, noted when the guards were most alert and when they were more relaxed, learned the layout of the grounds and the surrounding area. She wasn't consciously preparing for escape, or at least she told herself she wasn't, but she was gathering information nonetheless, filing away details that might someday be useful. The villa where they were held was about half a mile from the Tiber River. Classiella could see it from certain spots in the garden, could watch the water flowing south toward Rome, toward home. The river became a kind of obsession for her, a symbol of the freedom she lacked and the home she missed. The Tiber was the route home. If you could reach the river, if you could cross it safely, you could follow it south and eventually reach Rome. It was perhaps 20 miles from Clusium to Rome, a long walk but manageable for young, healthy people. The main obstacle wasn't distance, but the river itself. Crossing it was dangerous even under the best circumstances, and these weren't the best circumstances. Still, people crossed the Tiber regularly. Boats were the normal method. But the river was also fordable at certain points during certain seasons, and strong swimmers could make it across if they were determined enough. It wasn't impossible. It was just difficult and risky. And risky. Cloelia began thinking seriously about escape. About 3 weeks into their captivity. Not because conditions had worsened, they hadn't, but because 3 weeks had been long enough to learn the routines, to understand the opportunities, to realize that escape might actually be possible if she was willing to take the risks. The question was whether she should. The treaty explicitly covered the hostages. If she escaped, it could be interpreted as Rome violating the agreement, could give Porsenna justification to resume the siege or demand additional concessions. Her personal freedom mattered, certainly, but was it worth potentially restarting a war? Clefairy Creelweapon wrestled with this question for days. She lay awake at night thinking about it, weighing her desire for freedom against her responsibility to Rome, trying to determine the right course of action. Eventually, she reached a conclusion that might have been rationalization, but which satisfied her conscience. She hadn't signed the treaty. She hadn't agreed to be a hostage. That decision had been made for her by others, by the Senate and consuls and her father. So violating it wasn't her betrayal of an agreement, it was her reclaiming agency over her own life that others had presumed to control. It was sophisticated ethical reasoning for a 16-year-old, though perhaps not surprising for a young Roman woman raised in a republic that valued civic virtue and personal responsibility. Whatever the logic, Cloelia decided she was going to escape, going to return to Rome, and would accept whatever consequences followed from that decision. The next question was whether to go alone or try to take others with her. Going alone would be simpler, less risky, easier to execute without being detected, but it would also mean abandoning her fellow hostages, saving herself while leaving them behind. That seemed wrong, seemed cowardly, seemed like the opposite of Roman virtue. So Cloelia began quietly, carefully sounding out the other hostages. Not all of them. Some were too comfortable in Clusium, too risk-averse, too worried about the political implications of escape. But a few, particularly some of the younger girls who were most homesick, responded when she hinted at the possibility of leaving. "What if we didn't have to wait 6 months?" Chloe asked one evening, when several of them were sitting together in the garden, far enough from the guards to speak quietly. "What if we could go home now?" "We're hostages," one girl replied, confused by the question. "We can't just leave." "Why not?" Cloelia asked. "What's actually stopping us?" "Guards, walls, the river. But those are physical obstacles, not moral ones. We didn't choose to be here. We don't owe Porsenna or Clusium anything. We're Romans. We should be in Rome." The other girls looked at each other nervously, suddenly understanding what Cloelia was suggesting. "You're talking about escaping," one of them said, her voice a mixture of excitement and fear. "Actually running away." "I'm talking about going home," Cloelia corrected. "There's a difference, is there?" another girl asked skeptically. "Because it sounds like the same thing except you're using prettier words for it." "Maybe," Cloelia admitted. "But I'm going either way, alone if necessary, with company if possible. I'd rather not be alone, but I'm not staying here for 6 months when I could be home in a few days." Not all the girls agreed to join her. Some were too frightened, too concerned about the political implications, too comfortable with their current situation to risk changing it. But 4 agreed. 4 girls ranging from 14 to 17, all homesick enough and brave enough to try something that was either heroic or foolish depending on how it turned out. The planning was simple, because it had to be. Complicated plans meant more opportunities for things to go wrong, more chances of being discovered before they could execute. Cloelia's plan was straightforward. Wait for a night when the guards were least alert, slip out of the villa while everyone was asleep, make for the river and swim across. Then follow the Tiber south until they reached Rome. "The river's the hard part," Cloelia told the others. "It's cold, it's fast, and we'll be swimming in the dark. If any of you can't swim well, say so now. I'm not risking drowning someone." They all claimed to be adequate swimmers, raised as Roman children who played in the Tiber during summer months. Whether they were actually as capable as they thought remained to be seen, but Cloelia accepted their assurances. She couldn't protect everyone from every risk. She could only give them the chance and trust them to handle it. The opportunity came 2 nights later, on a moonless night when cloud cover made visibility particularly poor. The guards on duty were the ones Cloelia had identified as the least diligent, men who tended to doze at their posts or pay more attention to each other's conversation than to their charges. Cloelia and her 4 companions waited until well after midnight, until the villa was as quiet as it would get. Then they slipped out of their rooms, moving silently through the darkened corridors, out through a door that Cloelia had determined was least likely to be observed, into the gardens and then beyond. The trick was confidence. They didn't sneak or creep, which would have made them look suspicious. They simply walked, like they had permission to be there, like they belonged. And in the darkness, with the guards' attention elsewhere, it worked. They made it off the villa grounds without being challenged, without raising any alarm. Then they ran. Once they were clear of the immediate area, once they were certain they hadn't been followed, they ran through the night toward the river that represented freedom and home. 5 girls, ranging from 14 to 17, racing through Etruscan countryside in the darkness, hearts pounding with fear and exhilaration in equal measure. They reached the Tiber as dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. The river was broader and faster than Cloelia had hoped, the spring runoff making it higher and more dangerous than usual. Looking at it, understanding what they were about to attempt, several of the girls hesitated. "We can't cross this," one of them said, her voice shaking. "It's too fast. We'll drown." "We can cross it," Cloelia insisted, with more confidence than she felt. "We just have to be smart about it. We go together, Help each other, don't fight the current but let it carry us downstream while we swim across. We'll end up on the far bank further south than where we start, but we'll make it. And if we don't, then we die free, instead of living as hostages, Cloelia said. I'd rather die trying to get home than spend another 4 months waiting for someone else to give me permission to leave. It was harsh, but it was effective. The girls steeled themselves, and Cloelia led them into the water. The Tibor was shockingly cold, the kind of cold that took your breath away and made your muscles cramp. The current was strong, pulling at them immediately, trying to sweep them downstream or drag them under. And the distance to the far bank, which had looked manageable from shore, seemed impossibly far once they were actually in the water. Cloelia swam with desperate determination, her arms pulling through the water, her legs kicking, fighting to maintain her course while the current carried her downstream. She could hear the others nearby, gasping and struggling, but she couldn't help them. She could barely help herself. Each stroke was a battle against the river's strength, each breath a victory against panic. One of the younger girls started to go under, her strength failing, her technique falling apart. Another girl grabbed her, kept her head above water, helped her along while compromising her own swimming. They were going to make it or drown together, and that bond, that commitment to each other, was as Roman as anything Horatius or Scoala had done. The swim seemed to take forever. In reality, it was perhaps 10 minutes from shore to shore, though they ended up landing several hundred feet downstream from where they had entered. But those 10 minutes felt like hours, felt like an eternity of cold and fear and exhausted effort. Then, suddenly, blessedly, there was mud under Cloelia's feet. She could touch bottom, could wade the last few feet to shore, could crawl onto the bank and collapse, gasping and shivering and triumphant. The others followed, all 5 of them making it across, alive if exhausted. We did it, one of the girls said, her voice full of wonder. We actually did it. We're not home yet. Cloelia reminded her, though she was smiling despite her exhaustion. We still have to get to Rome. But yes, we did it. The hard part's over. They rested briefly, wrung out their clothes as best they could, and then started walking south along the river. They were on the Rome side of the Tiber now, no longer technically in Etruscan territory, no longer subject to Porsenna's authority. They were free, or as free as they could be, while still 20 miles from home. The walk took most of the day. They were tired, still wet and cold from the swim, with no food or resources beyond their determination to get home. But they walked, helped each other when someone stumbled, encouraged each other when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, kept moving because stopping meant giving up. Roman patrols found them late in the afternoon, about 5 miles north of the city. The soldiers stared in disbelief at these 5 young, wet, exhausted patrician girls walking along the Tiber. Girls who should have been safe in Clusium as hostages. We're going home, Cloelia told the patrol commander, and you're going to help us get there. They were brought to Rome in triumph. Citizens who heard about their escape lined the streets to see them, to cheer for these young women who had defied their captivity and swum the Tiber to come home. Children shouted Cloelia's name. Adults called out praise and encouragement. It was, in its way, as enthusiastic a reception as Horatius or Scaevola had received. But Publicola, when Cloelia and her companions were brought before him, looked less celebratory and more concerned. Do you understand what you've done? He asked. The political complications this creates? I've come home, Cloelia replied simply. We all have. We're Romans. We belong in Rome. You were hostages, Publicola said. Part of a treaty. Your presence in Clusium was Rome's guarantee of good faith. And now you've escaped, which Porsenna could interpret as Rome violating the treaty. I didn't violate anything, Cloelia said. I never agreed to be a hostage. That was decided for me. So leaving wasn't me breaking an agreement I made. It was me refusing to accept an agreement others made about my life without my consent. Publicola looked at her for a long moment, and despite his concern about the political implications, he couldn't help but smile slightly. That's a very Republican argument, he said. Very principled. Also very complicated for me as consul, because now I have to figure out what to do with you. Let us stay, Cloelia said. We're home. We're free. We're where we belong. And when Porsenna demands your return? When he says Rome violated the treaty? What then? Then we go back, Cloelia said, surprising him. If keeping the peace requires us to return, we'll return, but we'll do it as a choice, not as captives. We'll go back knowing we could escape if we wanted to, knowing we're there because we choose to honor the treaty, not because we have no other option. That's different. It was a sophisticated distinction. one that showed remarkable maturity for a 16-year-old. Publicola nodded slowly, recognizing both the girl's courage and her understanding of the political complexities involved. "The Senate will need to discuss this," he said. "But for now, welcome home, Chloe. Welcome home, all of you. What you did was brave, even if it's also going to give me diplomatic headaches for weeks." The Senate did discuss it, extensively and contentiously, when Porsenna's envoys arrived 3 days later demanding the hostages' return. The debate was about honor, about treaty obligations, about whether individuals had the right to prioritize personal freedom over political agreements. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Very Roman, very pragmatic. Clolia and the other escaped hostages would be returned to Clusium, but only if they agreed voluntarily. They would go back not as captives, but as free Romans choosing to honor their city's treaty commitments. When Publicola explained this to Clolia, she accepted without hesitation. "I'll go back," she said. "I proved I could escape if I wanted to. That's what mattered, showing that I'm there by choice, not by force. I can endure another few months knowing that." So Cloring and her companions were returned to Porsenna, travelling north under Roman escort, this time walking willingly rather than being compelled. Porsenna received them personally, and his reaction surprised everyone. He didn't rage about the insult or demand additional hostages as penalty. Instead, he looked at Cloelia with something close to admiration. "You swam the Tiber," he said, "in the dark with the spring current running high. That took courage." "It took desperation," Cloelia corrected him, "and homesickness, and stubbornness. I'm not sure that's the same as courage." "It's close enough," Porsenna said. He gestured to his servants. "Bring my finest horse." A magnificent animal was led forward. A beautiful mare, clearly valuable, the kind of horse that kings rode. Porsenna handed the reins to Cloelia. "This is yours," he said, "a gift in recognition of your courage and honor. You escaped, which I should perhaps punish, but then you returned voluntarily, which honors the treaty more than simple captivity ever could. That deserves recognition." Cloelia stared at the horse, then at Porsenna, trying to understand. "I don't understand," she admitted. "I violated your hospitality, escaped from custody, potentially undermined the treaty. Why are you rewarding me?" "Because you remind me of what I learnt from Horatius and Scaevola," Porsenna said, "that Romans are not like other people, that your republic creates a kind of virtue that monarchy cannot match. You were captive, yet you acted with freedom. You were bound by treaty, yet you chose honor over compulsion. That is worth more than obedience born of fear." He paused, then added, "Also, you're 16 and you swam the Tiber in the dark to go home. That's genuinely impressive regardless of politics." Cloelia took the horse's reins, still somewhat stunned by this turn of events. She had expected punishment, or at least harsh words. Instead, she had received praise and a gift from the very king, whose hospitality she had violated. "Thank you, King Porsenna," she said formally. "I will treasure this gift and remember your generosity." "Remember instead," Porsenna said, "that courage is recognized even by those it opposes. And tell your Senate that Lars Porsenna keeps his treaties not from fear but from respect. The hostages will be returned as agreed when the 6 months end, and they will be returned safely and with honor. You have my word." Cloelia and her companions served out the remainder of their time in Clusium, and true to his word, Porsenna treated them well and returned them safely when the treaty term ended. Cloelia rode back to Rome on her magnificent horse, a visible symbol of her adventure and of the respect she had earned even from an enemy. Her story spread throughout Rome and beyond. The girl who swam the Tiber, who chose freedom over captivity, who returned voluntarily to honor her city's treaties, became legendary. Statues would be raised to her. Poets would write about her. Parents would tell their daughters about Cloelia's courage and honor. She had become, alongside Horatius and Scaevola, one of the heroes of the siege, not through military prowess or assassin's determination, but through a kind of courage that was uniquely hers, the courage to reclaim agency over her own life, while still respecting the obligations that honor demanded. Rome had its heroes, 3 of them now, and their stories would endure for as long as Romans told stories about virtue, courage, and the price of freedom. The remainder of the hostage period passed quietly, almost anticlimactically after the drama of Closus' escape and return. The young Romans in Clusium settled into their routine, somewhat reassured by Porsenna's treatment of Cloelia, somewhat more confident that they would indeed be returned safely when the 6 months ended. Porsenna, for his part, seemed genuinely committed to demonstrating that he could be trusted, that his word as king meant something. The hostages were treated better after Cloela's return than they had been before, given more freedom within the city, invited to participate in Etruscan festivals and ceremonies, shown the kind of hospitality that turned captivity into something closer to cultural exchange. "It's almost pleasant now," one of the young men wrote in a letter home, carefully phrased to pass the Etruscan censors who read all outgoing correspondence. "We're learning much about Etruscan customs and language. The king has been generous and honourable. I believe we will return safely when our term ends." The letter, when it reached Rome, was read aloud in the Senate and distributed more widely. It served both to reassure anxious families and to reinforce the message that the peace was holding, that the treaty was being honoured by both sides, that this experiment in diplomatic resolution had been successful. Not everyone in Rome was entirely happy about the situation. There were still senators who felt the city had conceded too much, had given Porsenna undeserved respect, had allowed fear of starvation to override Roman pride. These dissenting voices continued to argue that Rome should have held out longer, should have demanded better terms, should have made Porsenna pay a higher price for peace. "We won that siege," one senator insisted during a debate about whether to send additional trade delegations to Clusium. Horatius held the bridge. Scaevola terrified Porsenna into negotiating. Clusium showed that Roman courage couldn't be contained. "Yet we're acting like we lost, like we're the ones who should be grateful for peace." "We didn't lose," Publicola replied patiently. He had made this argument many times now, but repetition seemed necessary. "But we also didn't win in any traditional sense. We survived. We maintained our independence. We proved the Republic could defend itself. But Porsenna wasn't defeated. He chose to make peace. That's different from victory, but it's better than the alternatives we were facing. So we should honour the man who besieged us, send him gifts and trade delegations. We should honour peace," Publicola said. "We should recognise that Porsenna could have been vengeful or cruel, could have mistreated our hostages, could have found excuses to violate the treaty. Instead, he's been honourable. That deserves acknowledgement, even from a former enemy." It was a nuanced position, one that some Romans found difficult to accept. They wanted clear victories and defeats, heroes and villains, simple narratives where Rome triumphed and enemies were humiliated. The reality of the peace with Porsenna was more complicated. Both sides had gained something, both had sacrificed something, and both were choosing to respect the agreement they had made. But complicated didn't mean unsuccessful. The peace was holding. Trade between Rome and the Etruscan cities was increasing. The threat of renewed warfare was diminishing, and Rome was recovering from the siege's hardships faster than anyone had expected. The agricultural recovery was particularly important. Farms that had been abandoned during the siege were being worked again. Fields that had gone unplanted were being prepared for next season's crops. Orchards that had been neglected were being pruned and maintained. The food supply, which had been Rome's greatest vulnerability during the siege, was being secured for the future. The city's population, which had been drawn into the defensive perimeter during the siege, began spreading back out into the surrounding countryside. Rural communities that had been evacuated started to repopulate. The region was returning to something like normalcy, though a normalcy marked by new defensive awareness and new appreciation for how vulnerable agriculture made them to siege warfare. "We need granaries," one senator proposed in a debate about defensive preparations. "Large, secure granaries that can hold enough food to sustain the city for a year or more, so that if we're ever besieged again, we don't face starvation after just a few months." The proposal was approved, and work began on constructing substantial grain storage facilities throughout Rome. It was the kind of boring, practical preparation that didn't make for inspiring stories, but which would prove invaluable in future conflicts. The siege had taught Rome that heroism alone wasn't enough. You also needed logistics, planning, and adequate supplies. As the 6-month hostage period drew to a close, preparations began for their return. Porsenna sent word that he would personally escort the hostages back to Rome, that he wanted to formally conclude the treaty with appropriate ceremony, that he wished to demonstrate his respect for Rome and its republic. Some in the Senate were suspicious of this. Why would Porsenna come to Rome personally? Was this some kind of trick, some plan to survey Roman defences, some pretext for future action? The debate about whether to permit the visit was contentious. "He's coming to honour the peace," Publicola argued, "to show that he respects us, that the treaty is more than just words on parchment. Refusing his visit would be an insult, would suggest we don't trust the peace we negotiated. We shouldn't trust it entirely," a cautious senator objected. "Peace is fragile, especially with someone who besieged us so recently." "Peace is always fragile," Publicola acknowledged. but it becomes less fragile when both sides commit to it genuinely. Porsenna is offering that commitment. We should accept it. The vote was close, but ultimately the Senate agreed to receive Porsenna. Preparations were made for a formal state visit. The first time an Etruscan king would enter Republican Rome as an honoured guest rather than as an enemy or ally of the expelled Tarquins. The visit itself was remarkable, and not least because of how strange it felt to Romans who had so recently been defending their walls against Porsenna's army. Here was the man who had besieged them, who had cut off their food supply, who had threatened their existence, and he was being welcomed into the city with ceremony and respect. Porsenna arrived with a modest escort, enough to maintain dignity, but not so many as to appear threatening. He entered Rome through the Porta Fontinalis, the gate that had been so heavily defended during the siege, now standing open in peace. Citizens lined the streets to see him, their feelings complex. Curiosity, mixed with lingering resentment, mixed with grudging respect for an enemy who had proven honourable. The hostages accompanied him, riding in positions of honour, clearly healthy and well-treated. Cloelia rode her magnificent horse, the gift from Porsenna, visible proof that the king had not only kept his word, but had exceeded the requirements of the treaty. The formal ceremony took place in the Forum, that space that had seen so much of Rome's recent history: Lucretia's body, Brutus's oath, the debates about creating the Republic, the preparations for war, and now the celebration of peace. Porsenna stood before the assembled Senate and citizens, and he spoke in Latin, which he had learned for this occasion, showing respect for Roman customs. "Senators and citizens of Rome," Porsenna began, his accent clear but his words carefully chosen. "I come before you not as conqueror or defeated, but as one who has learned respect. When I marched on your city, I believed I understood what I faced. A rebellious city that had overthrown its king, a disordered people trying something new and unstable. I believed I could restore what I saw as proper order." He paused, and the crowd was silent, listening to this remarkable admission from a king who rarely admitted error. "I was wrong," Porsenna continued. "I did not understand what the Republic had created here. I did not comprehend the kind of virtue and courage that free people defending their freedom could demonstrate. Horatius at the bridge, Scaevola in my camp, Clusium crossing the Tiber. These were not the actions of a disordered people. These were the actions of a people who knew exactly what they valued and were willing to sacrifice everything to preserve it. I could have continued the siege," he went on. "I had the forces, the resources, the time. But I came to understand that even if I succeeded, even if I starved you into submission or breached your walls, I would not have conquered Rome. I would merely have occupied a city full of people who would never truly submit, who would resist in 1,000 ways, who would make every day of occupation a struggle. So I chose peace. Not from weakness, but from wisdom. Not from fear, but from respect. And I am here today to tell you that Lars Porsenna, King of Clusium, recognizes the Roman Republic as legitimate, honourable, and worthy of alliance rather than opposition." It was an extraordinary statement, especially coming from a monarch who had built his career on traditional authority and royal prerogative. He was acknowledging that the Republic, this strange new experiment in self-government, was not just acceptable but admirable, not just tolerable but worthy of respect. The crowd erupted in applause, and not just polite ceremonial applause but genuine appreciation. Porsenna had said what Romans had desperately needed to hear: that their revolution had been legitimate, that their republic was viable, that they weren't just rebels or criminals, but people trying something brave and new. Publicola stepped forward and clasped Porsenna's hand in the Roman manner, and the crowd cheered louder. It was a powerful moment of reconciliation, of two former enemies acknowledging each other's honour, of choosing cooperation over continued hostility. "King Porsenna," Publicola said, "Rome accepts your friendship and offers its own in return. We fought because we misunderstood each other. Now we understand, and we can build something better than conflict. Welcome to Rome as friend and ally." The hostages were formally returned to their families in a ceremony that combined joy and relief and gratitude. Parents who had spent 6 months worrying whether they would ever see their children again embraced them with tears and laughter. The young people themselves, who had endured captivity with varying degrees of grace, were finally home, their service to Rome complete. Porsenna personally presented each hostage with gifts, not as elaborate as Cladruna's horse, but substantial tokens of respect. Gold jewellery for the girls, fine weapons for the boys, all marked with Etruscan craftsmanship that would remind them of their time in Clusium and of the peace that had brought them home safely. "You honoured your city by serving as hostages," Porsenna told them. "And you honoured me by trusting that I would keep my word to return you safely. That trust, on both sides, is what makes peace possible. Over the following days, while Porsenna remained in Rome as a guest, discussions continued about the future relationship between Rome and Clusium. Trade agreements were finalized, establishing routes and terms that would benefit both cities. Border disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than warfare. Cultural exchanges were proposed, with scholars and artisans traveling between the cities to share knowledge and techniques. It was the kind of practical diplomacy that built lasting peace. Not grand gestures or dramatic treaties, but steady work to create mutual benefit, to give both sides reasons to maintain good relations, to make peace more profitable than war. Publicola and Porsenna spent considerable time together during this visit, and a genuine friendship seemed to develop between them. They were very different men, one a republican consul committed to shared governance, the other a traditional king who ruled absolutely, but they recognized in each other a commitment to doing what they believed was best for their respective cities. "How does it work?" Porsenna asked during one of their private conversations. "This republic of yours, how do you make decisions when power is divided, when you must persuade rather than command?" Slowly, Publicola admitted with a smile, and messily, "Every decision requires debate, consensus, compromise. It's frustrating sometimes, but it also means that when we do make decisions, they have broad support. People follow laws they helped create more willingly than laws imposed from above." "But what about in crisis?" Porsenna pressed. "When quick decisions are needed, when there's no time for debate, then we appoint a dictator," Publicola explained. "A single leader with absolute authority, but only for 6 months, and only for a specific crisis. When the crisis ends, the dictatorship ends, and power returns to the consuls and senate." Porsenna shook his head, bemused. "You Romans make everything so complicated. Why not just have a good king who rules wisely?" "Because good kings become bad kings," Publicola said. "Or good kings die and are replaced by bad kings. Power corrupts, especially absolute power. Our system is complicated because it's designed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power, from becoming another Tarquin. And if someone tries, if someone attempts to seize power despite your safeguards, then we stop them," Publicola said simply. "That's what the oath means, the oath that every Roman swears. We will never again permit anyone to reign as king. That's not just a political position, it's a sacred commitment, witnessed by the gods. We would rather die than submit to tyranny again." Porsenna was silent for a moment, digesting this. Then he smiled slightly. "I believe you," he said. "I saw Horatius Scaevola, Cloelia. I understand what you're willing to die for. It's impressive, even if I think you're making governance harder than it needs to be, probably." Publicola agreed, "But we'd rather have it hard and free than easy and enslaved." When Porsenna's visit ended and he prepared to return to Clusium, the farewell was genuinely warm. This man who had been Rome's enemy had become, if not quite a friend, at least a respected ally. His visit had accomplished more than just ceremonial conclusion of the treaty. It had established a genuine relationship between Rome and the Etruscan cities, had shown that the Republic could conduct diplomacy effectively, had demonstrated that former enemies could become partners. "If you ever need assistance," Porsenna told Publicola before departing, "if some other power threatens Rome, send word to Clusium. We may have different systems of government, but we have mutual respect. That counts for something. It counts for much," Publicola replied. "And the same offer stands for Clusium. Rome does not forget its friends." Porsenna rode north with his escort, the dust of his passage settling on the Via Cassia, the Roman road that now connected former enemies in peace rather than dividing them in war. In the months that followed, Rome continued to thrive. The Republic was no longer a fragile experiment, but an established fact, proven in crisis, validated by survival. Other Latin cities observed Rome's success and began considering their own republican reforms. The idea that people could govern themselves was spreading, and Rome stood as the primary example of what was possible. The heroes of the siege, Horatius, Scaevola, Clusium, became legendary figures whose stories were told throughout Italy and beyond. They represented different aspects of Roman virtue: military courage, personal sacrifice, determination to be free. Together their stories created a narrative about what it meant to be Roman, about the values that the Republic embodied. Statues were raised to all three. Horatius received a statue near where the Pons Sublician had stood before its destruction, a reminder of the day one man held back an army. Scaevola was honoured with a statue in the Forum, his right hand visibly damaged, a permanent testament to his willingness to endure pain rather than betray his city. And Clusium received an equestrian statue on the Via Sacra, mounted on her magnificent horse, the young woman who had swum the Tiber and then returned voluntarily to honor her city's commitments. These were not just commemorations of individuals, but statements about values, about what Rome celebrated and aspired to. Future Romans would see these statues and be reminded of what their ancestors had done, what standards they were expected to live up to, what it meant to be worthy of Roman citizenship. The Senate, in one of their more reflective moments, passed a resolution that was recorded for posterity. It read, in part, "In the year 508 BC, Rome was besieged by a powerful enemy. We survived not through superior numbers or resources, but through courage, determination, and commitment to freedom. Let this be recorded so that future generations will know. The Republic endures because Romans are willing to sacrifice for it, because we value freedom more than comfort, because we believe that self-governance is worth whatever price it demands." It was a bit self-congratulatory, perhaps, but it was also true. Rome had faced an existential threat, and had survived through a combination of military courage, diplomatic skill, and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender what they had won. The Republic had been tested, and had proven itself viable. As the year 58 BC drew to a close and preparations began for the next year's consular elections, Romans could look back on 12 months that had changed everything. They had started the year with a republic that was still uncertain, still experimental, still wondering if it could actually work. They ended it with a republic that had proven itself, that had produced heroes, that had earned respect even from its enemies. The age of kings was truly over. The age of the republic had not just begun, but had been validated, proven, established as something that could endure. And while challenges would continue, there would be more wars, more crises, more tests of Roman resolve. The pattern had been set. Rome would face its problems as free citizens rather than as subjects, would make decisions through debate rather than decree, would defend its freedom with whatever courage was necessary. The siege of 508 BC was over, but its lessons would echo through centuries of Roman history, would shape how Romans understood themselves, would define what it meant to be a citizen of a republic rather than a subject of a king. 3 heroes had emerged from that siege. But in truth, every Roman who had endured the hardship, who had defended the walls, who had kept faith with the Republic during its darkest hours, they were all heroes. They had all contributed to something remarkable, the survival and validation of the first great republic of the ancient world, and history would remember them for it. In the years that followed the siege of 508 BC, Romans would sometimes ask themselves a peculiar question. What if Porsenna had never come? What if the Etruscan king had decided that Rome's internal politics were none of his concern, that besieging the city was more trouble than it was worth, that the Republic could be safely ignored? It's impossible to say with certainty, of course. History doesn't offer such neat counterfactuals, but there's a reasonable argument to be made that without Porsenna's siege, the Roman Republic might not have survived, not because Rome would have been conquered. The military threat, while serious, was survivable, but because the Republic needed exactly the kind of test that the siege provided. Consider where Rome stood before Porsenna arrived. The monarchy had been overthrown less than a year earlier. The Republic had been established hastily, its institutions improvised, its procedures uncertain. Romans were still figuring out what it meant to be citizens rather than subjects, still learning how to make collective decisions, still wondering if this whole experiment might collapse at any moment. There was enthusiasm, certainly. There was commitment to the idea of freedom, but there wasn't yet proof that the Republic could work under pressure, that it could defend itself against serious threats, that it could inspire the kind of loyalty and sacrifice that survival required. The siege provided that proof. It forced Romans to demonstrate their commitment to the Republic in concrete, measurable ways. It created circumstances where abstract principles about freedom and self-governance had to be translated into actual behavior, standing on walls, enduring hunger, risking death. And it produced heroes, whose stories gave those abstract principles human form, made them real and inspiring, rather than just theoretical ideals. Horatius Coocles, standing alone on the bridge, became the embodiment of defensive courage, the willingness to sacrifice yourself to protect others, to hold the line when retreat would be easier, to believe that one person standing for the right cause could make a difference against impossible odds. Gaius Mucius Scaevola, burning his hand in Porsenna's camp, represented offensive determination, the willingness to take action rather than wait passively, to risk everything for victory, to show enemies that Roman resolve extended beyond endurance to active resistance. And Chloea, swimming the Tiber, and then choosing to return, embodied moral autonomy, the idea that true freedom meant making your own choices even when those choices were difficult, that honor required keeping commitments even when you could escape them. That virtue was demonstrated through actions rather than just words. These three became more than just people who did brave things. They became symbols, archetypes, examples that future Romans would invoke when they needed to explain what Roman virtue looked like, what the Republic demanded from its citizens, what it meant to be worthy of freedom. Parents told their children about Horatius when teaching them about courage and duty. Teachers used Scavola's story to illustrate determination and self-sacrifice. Young women learned about Cloelia as an example of how virtue and agency could coexist, how you could be both strong and honourable, both independent and committed to the common good. The stories were embellished over time, of course. That's what happens with legends. Details get added, dramatic elements get emphasized, the heroes become slightly more heroic than the historical people probably were. But the core truth remained. 3 Romans, in the siege of 508 BC, had done remarkable things that saved their city and defined what it meant to be republican citizens. And that truth shaped Roman identity for centuries. But the siege's impact went beyond creating individual heroes. It also validated the Republic's institutions and decision-making processes in ways that no amount of theoretical argument could have achieved. The Senate, which had been dismissed by some as inefficient and argumentative, had proven it could function in crisis. The debates during the siege had been long and sometimes contentious, yes, but they had also produced workable solutions. The decision to defend rather than surrender, the strategy of holding the bridges, the authorization of Scavola's mission, the negotiation of terms with Porsenna. The consuls, particularly Publicola, had demonstrated that elected leaders could be as effective as hereditary kings, perhaps more so because they had to maintain popular support rather than simply commanding obedience. Publicola's leadership during the siege, his military preparations, his diplomatic skill, his fair distribution of burdens, had shown that republican government could work even under extreme pressure. The people themselves, gathered in assemblies, had made crucial decisions about war and peace, about accepting or rejecting treaty terms, about supporting or opposing various policies. They had proven that ordinary citizens, given information and opportunity to deliberate, could make sound judgments about complex matters. This was revolutionary stuff, really. Most ancient societies assumed that only kings or aristocratic councils could handle the complexities of governance, but common people lacked the education or wisdom to make important decisions. Rome was demonstrating that this assumption was wrong, that free citizens could govern themselves effectively if given the chance and the structures to do so. The peaceful resolution with Porsenna also established important precedents for how the Republic would handle foreign relations. The negotiations had shown that Rome could be flexible without being weak, could make compromises without surrendering principles, could turn enemies into allies through respect and honourable dealing. Porsenna's visit to Rome, his acknowledgement of the Republic's legitimacy, his gifts to the hostages and his friendship with Publicola, all of this demonstrated that the Republic could command respect on the international stage, that other powers would take Rome seriously as a political entity, rather than dismissing it as a temporary aberration. This mattered enormously for Rome's future development. If the Republic had been seen as weak or illegitimate, if other cities had continued to view it as a rebellious anomaly that would soon collapse, Rome would have faced constant external pressure, constant attempts to restore monarchy, constant challenges to its very existence. Instead, Porsenna's recognition gave the Republic credibility. Other cities and kings would have to accept that Rome's government was Rome's choice, that the Republic was a permanent feature of the political landscape, rather than a passing phase. The economic recovery from the siege also proceeded faster than anyone had expected. The disruption to agriculture had been significant but not catastrophic, one season's crops mostly lost, but the farms themselves intact, ready to be worked again once the siege lifted. Trade resumed quickly, with Etruscan cities and Latin neighbours eager to re-establish commercial relationships that benefited everyone. The granaries that Rome built in the siege's aftermath became models for other cities. The idea of maintaining strategic food reserves, of preparing for potential future sieges or famines, spread throughout Italy. It was a practical lesson learned from hard experience. Hope for peace, but prepare for war, and make sure you can feed your population under any circumstances. Rome's population, which had been anxious and sometimes frightened during the siege, emerged from the experience with a stronger sense of identity and purpose. They were no longer just people who happened to live in Rome. They were Romans, citizens of a republic, participants in something unprecedented and important. This collective identity would prove crucial in the years ahead, as Rome faced new challenges and conflicts. The siege had taught Romans that they were part of something larger than themselves, that individual sacrifice for the common good was not just admirable but necessary, that freedom required constant vigilance and occasional hardship. The year 50 BC became a reference point in Roman chronology, a year that Romans would look back on and say, "That's when we knew the Republic would survive. That's when we proved we could defend our freedom. That's when we became truly Roman." Future generations would measure themselves against the standards set by Horatius, Scaevola, and Cloelia. During times of crisis, Romans would ask what would they have done, and find courage in the answer. During debates about policy, senators would invoke the siege as an example of how Romans should behave, what values should guide decisions, what principles were worth fighting for. The stories became teaching tools, moral exemplars, cultural touchstones. They were told in schools and in homes, depicted in art and referenced in literature, used to explain what made Rome special, what distinguished Roman virtue from the characteristics of other peoples. And there was truth in these stories, despite their legendary embellishments. Horatius really had defended the bridge. Scaevola really had infiltrated Porsenna's camp and burned his hand. Cloelia really had swum the Tiber. The courage was real, the sacrifice was real, the commitment to freedom was real. That reality, that foundation of actual historical events supporting the legendary superstructure, gave the stories power and authenticity. They weren't just myths or fables. They were history, things that had really happened, examples that could genuinely be followed. As the years passed and Rome's power grew, as the Republic expanded from a city-state to a regional power, to eventually an empire that controlled the Mediterranean world, Romans never forgot the siege of 50 BC. It remained a touchstone, a reminder of where they had come from, what they had endured, what values had made their success possible. Military commanders facing difficult battles would remember Horatius and find inspiration for last stands and desperate defences. Politicians navigating complex diplomatic situations would recall how Publicola had turned an enemy into an ally and seek similar solutions. Young people struggling with questions of duty and personal freedom would think about Cloelia's choice and find guidance in her example. The Republic itself, the system of government that had seemed so fragile in 509 BC and so vulnerable during the siege of 508 BC, proved remarkably durable. It would last for nearly 500 years, surviving internal conflicts and external threats, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core principles. That durability wasn't guaranteed by the siege's successful conclusion. Rome would face many more challenges, many more moments when the Republic's survival seemed uncertain. But the siege established patterns and precedents that would serve Rome well in those future crises: the willingness to sacrifice for the common good, the belief that free citizens could govern themselves, the understanding that courage and virtue mattered more than wealth or birth. On quiet evenings in Rome, years after the siege, older citizens would sometimes gather and share their memories of that time. They would talk about the fear and hunger, about watching from the walls as Porsenna's army camped in the fields, about the day Horatius held the bridge, and the night Scaevola infiltrated the enemy camp, and the morning news arrived that Cloelia had swum the Tiber. These conversations were not always entirely accurate. Memory is fallible, and dramatic events tend to become more dramatic in retelling. But they served an important purpose. They connected Romans to their own history, reminded them of what their city had endured and overcome, reinforced the values and principles that defined Roman identity. And when children heard these stories, when young people absorbed the legends and lessons of the siege, they inherited more than just historical knowledge. They inherited a responsibility to live up to the standards set by their predecessors, to defend the Republic as courageously as Horatius had, to sacrifice as willingly as Scaevola had, to choose honor as deliberately as Cloelia had. That inheritance, that sense of obligation to the past and responsibility to the future, was what made Roman citizenship meaningful. It wasn't just a legal status conferring rights and privileges. It was membership in a community, defined by shared values, by commitment to freedom, by willingness to sacrifice for the common good. The siege of 508 BC had tested whether Romans truly believed in those values, or just talked about them. The answer, written in Horatius's stand and Scaevola's sacrifice in Cloetia's courage, was clear. They believed. They were willing to die for their republic, willing to endure hardship for their freedom, willing to do whatever it took to preserve what they had built. And because they proved this in 508 BC, because they demonstrated their commitment when it mattered most, the Republic endured. Not forever. Nothing human endures forever, but for long enough to change the world, to influence the development of Western civilization, to provide a model of republican government that would inspire people for millennia. The siege also changed how Romans thought about heroism itself. Before 508 BC, Roman heroes had been mostly military figures. warriors who won battles, kings who expanded territory, generals who conquered enemies. These were important and celebrated, certainly, but they represented a limited view of what heroism could be. Horatius, Scaevola, and Clusium expanded that definition. They showed that heroism could be defensive as well as offensive, personal as well as military, moral as well as physical. You could be a hero by holding a bridge, or by burning your own hand, or by swimming a river. You could be a hero through endurance, or action, or choice. And importantly, you could be a hero regardless of age or gender. Horatius had been a junior officer, not a senior commander. Scaevola had been a young patrician, not an experienced warrior. Claudia had been a 16-year-old girl, not a soldier at all. Yet all three had achieved things that changed history. This democratization of heroism, this idea that anyone could be a hero if they were brave enough and committed enough, fit perfectly with Republican values. If the Republic was about ordinary citizens governing themselves, about people taking responsibility for their own freedom, then heroism shouldn't be limited to professional warriors or aristocratic elites. It should be accessible to anyone willing to sacrifice for the common good. As the years turned into decades and then centuries, as Rome's power grew and its influence spread, the stories of the siege retained their power and relevance. New generations heard about Horatius and Scaevola and Clusium, and found in those stories the inspiration they needed for their own challenges. When Rome faced the invasion of the Gauls in 390 BC, when the city was sacked and burned, survivors remembered how Rome had endured the siege of Porsenna and found hope that recovery was possible. When the Republic faced internal conflict between patricians and plebeians, both sides invoked the siege to argue for their positions, patricians citing the need for experienced leadership, plebeians pointing to how common citizens had been the true heroes of the defense. When Rome fought the Punic Wars against Carthage, when Hannibal's army threatened the city itself, Romans remembered Horatius at the bridge and found courage for their own desperate defenses. When corruption threatened republican institutions, reformers invoked Scaevola's willingness to sacrifice everything for principle. When women sought greater recognition and rights, they pointed to Clusium as proof that female virtue and courage deserved respect. The siege of 508 BC had become more than just history. It had become mythology in the best sense, stories that carried truth and meaning beyond their literal facts, that taught lessons and inspired behavior, that helped define what it meant to be Roman. And in the quiet moments, in the pauses between Rome's triumphs and disasters, in the ordinary daily life of citizens going about their business in the forum or the markets or the Senate, the statues of the three heroes stood as permanent reminders. Horatius near the bridge, Scaevola in the forum, Clusium on the Via Sacra. These were not just decorations or tourist attractions. They were statements of values, declarations of what Rome honored and aspired to, promises to future generations that the courage and sacrifice of the past would never be forgotten. On a quiet evening many years after the siege, an old man who had been a young soldier during those desperate days stood before Horatius's statue and looked up at the bronze figure holding the bridge against impossible odds. Beside him stood his grandson, a boy of perhaps 10, who had heard the stories but couldn't quite imagine what they meant. Did it really happen like that? The boy asked. One man holding back a whole army? It really happened, the old man confirmed. I was there. I saw it. He stood alone while we destroyed the bridge behind him, and he wouldn't let them pass. Just one man, standing for Rome. Was he scared? Terrified, I imagine. I know I was, and I was watching from safety. But he did it anyway. That's what courage means, doing the right thing even when you're afraid. The boy thought about this, looking up at the statue with new understanding. Could I do something like that? He asked. The old man put his hand on his grandson's shoulder. I hope you never have to, he said. But if the time comes, if Rome needs you the way it needed Horatius, I believe you would, because you're Roman. And Romans defend their freedom, whatever it costs. They stood together for a moment longer, grandfather and grandson, one generation connected to the next, the past informing the present and shaping the future. Then they turned and walked home through the streets of Rome, past the Forum where Scaevola's statue stood, past the Via Sacra where Clusium rode her bronze horse, through a city that was free because people had been willing to fight for that freedom. The siege of 508 BC was long over. Lars Porsenna had returned to Clusium and eventually died, succeeded by other kings whose names history barely remembers. The hostages had all returned home, grown up, lived their lives and passed away. Even the three heroes themselves had eventually died, Horatius from his wounds years later, Scaevola from old age, Cloelia, after a long life that saw the republic she helped save grow strong and prosperous. But their stories endured. Their examples remained. And as long as Romans told stories about courage and sacrifice and the price of freedom, as long as they valued virtue and honor and civic duty, the siege of 508 BC would matter, because it had proven something essential: that free people defending their freedom were stronger than any army, that courage could achieve the impossible, that the Republic was worth whatever it cost to preserve. The age of kings had ended. The age of the Republic continued. And three heroes, a soldier, a young patrician, and a girl, had shown the world what Romans were capable of when their freedom was at stake. Rome endured, the Republic endured, and the legends that explained why it endured, that taught future generations what values made survival possible, would endure as long as people cared about freedom and were willing to defend it. Sleep well, knowing that courage matters, that sacrifice has meaning, that standing for the right cause can change history. The siege of 5008 BC is over, but its lessons echo still, and that's the end of our story, for tonight at least. The Republic has survived its greatest test. New challenges await, but that's a story for another time. Rest now and dream of heroes.